Sarah believed her older sister was a complete failure who would never amount to anything in life. What she didn't know was that this quiet veteran sitting across from her at the corporate charity gala had earned the highest respect from some of the most powerful people in the business world. When her CEO walked over and bowed deeply to her, everything she thought she knew about her sister was about to be shattered forever. The grand ballroom of the Riverside Convention Center buzzed with the gentle hum of networking conversations and the soft clink of champagne glasses. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light across round tables draped in pristine white linens, each adorned with elegant centerpieces of white roses and baby's breath. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. This was the annual charity gala for Children's Hospital of Philadelphia, one of the most prestigious fundraising events in the city, where corporate executives, successful entrepreneurs, and influential philanthropists gathered to support a worthy cause while showcasing their social status. Maria Thompson sat quietly at table 12, slightly removed from the main action near the stage. At 34, she cut an unremarkable figure in her simple black dress from a department store, paired with modest heels that were comfortable rather than fashionable. The dress was clean and appropriate but lacked the designer details that marked the other women in attendance. Her dark hair was pulled back in a neat bun, and she wore minimal makeup, giving her an understated appearance. To most observers, she looked like someone who might work as an administrative assistant or perhaps a teacher, invited as someone's guest rather than earning her place among the city's elite. Marcus had been out of the military for 8 months now after completing 2 tours in Iraq and 1 in Afghanistan over the past 6 years. The transition to civilian life had been more challenging than he'd anticipated. Unlike the clear structure and purpose of military service, the corporate world felt foreign and unwelcoming. He'd been taking odd jobs while figuring out his next steps, working as a night security guard at a downtown office building, and occasionally helping with construction projects on weekend. The work paid the bills for his modest studio apartment, but it wasn't the kind of career that impressed anyone, especially not his family. Tonight, Maria was here as the guest of her younger sister Sarah, who worked as a senior marketing director for Meridian Technologies, one of the city's fastest-growing tech companies. Sarah had insisted she attend, though her motivations weren't entirely charitable. At 29, she had built an impressive career for herself, earning a 6-figure salary and recognition within her industry. She lived in a sleek downtown loft, drove a BMW, and traveled frequently for both business and pleasure. In her mind, she had surpassed her older sister in every meaningful way, and she wasn't above using opportunities like this to reinforce that hierarchy. The evening had started pleasantly enough. Maria had arrived precisely on time, a habit ingrained by years of military discipline, and found Sarah's table near the front of the ballroom. Her colleagues from Meridian Technologies filled most of the seats, a collection of ambitious young professionals, dressed in designer suits and cocktail dresses. They had welcomed Maria politely but with the subtle condescension often reserved for those perceived as less successful. When introductions were made, Sarah had described her simply as my sister who's between jobs right now, a description that wasn't technically false but felt deliberately diminishing. As the evening progressed, Maria found herself observing rather than participating in the conversations around her. Her table mates discussed quarterly earnings, market projections, and expensive vacation destinations with the easy confidence of people who had never worried about making rent. Maria listened politely, occasionally nodding or offering brief comments when directly addressed, but mostly she remained quiet. This wasn't her world, and she felt no need to pretend otherwise. The charity auction had been entertaining, with various items and experiences going for impressive sums. Maria watched as her sister's CEO, Jonathan Pierce, the founder and head of Meridian Technologies, successfully bid $12,000 for a week-long vacation package to Costa Rica. Pierce was everything Maria expected from a tech company leader: mid-40s, perfectly styled silver hair, an expensive suit that probably cost more than Maria made in a month, and the kind of confident demeanor that came from years of commanding boardrooms and closing million-dollar deals. During the dinner portion of the evening, Maria had excused herself briefly to step outside for some fresh air. The ballroom's atmosphere, thick with perfume, cologne, and the competitive energy of networking, had become overwhelming. She spent 15 minutes on the convention center's outdoor terrace, looking out at the city lights and thinking about her former teammates, who were still deployed overseas. The contrast between this world of privilege and the harsh realities she'd left behind felt almost surreal. When she returned to the table, the conversation had shifted to personal achievements and career milestones. Sarah's colleagues were sharing stories about promotions, successful projects, and professional recognition. The tone was friendly but competitive, each person trying to subtly establish their place in the hierarchy of success. Maria resumed her seat quietly, hoping to blend back into the background, but Sarah had other plans. "You know," Sarah said, her voice carrying just loud enough for the entire table to hear, "it's interesting how differently people's lives turn out." She glanced at Marcus with a smile that didn't quite reach her eye. "I mean, here we all are, building careers and making something of ourselves, and then you have people who just seem to drift through life without any real direction or ambition." The comment hung in the air like an uncomfortable cloud. Maria felt the subtle shift in attention as the table's occupants tried to process whether they had just witnessed a family moment or something more pointed. She kept her expression neutral, a skill perfected through years of maintaining composure under pressure, but inside she felt the familiar sting of her sister's casual cruelty. Maria had grown up with Sarah's competitive nature and her need to establish herself as the successful sibling, but tonight felt different. Perhaps it was the public setting, or maybe it was the stress of her recent struggles with civilian life, but her words cut deeper than usual. She thought about the friends she'd lost in combat, the families she'd helped evacuate from dangerous situations, the nights she'd spent on watch so others could sleep safely. None of that seemed to matter in this world of quarterly reports and networking events. The conversation gradually resumed around the table, but Maria could sense the changed dynamic. She had been categorized, filed away in the minds of Sarah's colleagues, as the unsuccessful family member, the cautionary tale of wasted potential. It was a role she'd grown accustomed to playing in civilian settings, where military service was respected in abstract terms, but didn't translate to the kind of success these people understood and valued. Sarah's comment about people drifting through life without direction had created an awkward pause at the table, but the conversation soon moved on to safer topics. Maria continued to sit quietly, sipping her water and observing the dynamics around her. What the others at the table didn't notice were the small details that revealed far more about her than her modest appearance suggested. When the waiter accidentally knocked over a wine glass while serving dessert, sending red wine splashing toward the white tablecloth, Maria's reaction was immediate and precise. Without thinking, she caught the falling glass mid-air with her left hand while simultaneously using her napkin to block the wine from reaching the woman sitting next to her. The entire sequence happened so quickly and smoothly that most people barely registered it, but her movements displayed the kind of reflexes and spatial awareness that only came from years of intensive training. "Nice catch," said David Chen, one of Sarah's colleagues from the marketing department, looking impressed. "You've got some serious reflexes there." Maria smiled modestly. "Just lucky timing, I guess." But it wasn't luck, and she knew. Years of military training had honed her reaction time to near perfection. In combat zones, the difference between life and death often came down to split-second responses to unexpected situations. Catching a falling wine glass was nothing compared to disarming an improvised explosive device or responding to incoming sniper fire, but the muscle memory remained the same. As the evening progressed, other subtle signs of Maria's background began to emerge for those observant enough to notice. When the ballroom's lights dimmed for a slideshow presentation about the children's hospital, Maria's eyes automatically scanned the room, noting exit locations, security personnel positions, and potential blind spots. It was an unconscious habit developed during deployments, where situational awareness was a matter of survival. During the presentation, which featured heartbreaking stories of young patients and their recoveries, Maria noticed something that made her sit up straighter. One of the slides showed a group of children in a hospital playroom, and in the background, barely visible, was a familiar piece of military equipment. It was a tactical communication device that she recognized immediately, the kind used in field hospitals during her deployment to Afghanistan. The image was from a mobile field hospital that had been set up in Kandahar province, and Maria knew it well because she had been there. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The presentation continued with more images of the hospital's work, including several shots from various international humanitarian missions. Maria recognized locations from her deployments, medical equipment she had helped install, and even a few faces of military medical personnel she had worked alongside. The connection between the children's hospital and military humanitarian efforts was becoming clearer, though she remained silent about her recognition of the scenes being displayed. Sarah, meanwhile, had been drinking steadily throughout the evening, and the wine was beginning to loosen her tongue. As the presentation ended and the lights came back up, she turned to Maria with a look that her sister recognized as dangerous. It was the same expression Sarah had worn as a teenager when she was about to say something deliberately hurtful, usually in front of their parents or friends to maximize the embarrassment. "You know, Maria," Sarah said, her voice carrying just a bit too loudly, "I was thinking about what I said earlier, and I realize I might have been too harsh." She paused dramatically, as if reconsidering her words. "I mean, not everyone can be successful in the traditional sense. Some people are just better suited for simpler things." The comment was delivered with a smile, but everyone at the table could sense the underlying cruelty. Maria felt her jaw tighten slightly, but she maintained her composed expression. She had learned long ago that responding to Sarah's provocations only encouraged her to escalate further. Jennifer Walsh, the senior vice president of client relations at Meridian Technologies, looked uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. "Military service is incredibly valuable," she said diplomatically. "We should all be grateful for people who serve our country." "Oh, absolutely," Sarah agreed quickly, though her tone suggested otherwise. "I have tremendous respect for our military. It's just that, well, some people seem to get stuck in that world and never really adapt to civilian life. They end up taking security guard jobs and living in tiny apartments, because they can't figure out how to translate their experience into something meaningful in the real world." Maria felt the familiar burn of anger building in her chest, but she forced herself to remain calm. She thought about her teammates who were still serving overseas, putting their lives on the line every day while Sarah sat in air-conditioned offices, complaining about marketing budgets and client presentation. She thought about the medical training that had allowed her to save lives in some of the most dangerous places on Earth. Skills that were apparently worthless in her sister's estimation. "Everyone's path is different," Maria said quietly, her voice steady despite the turmoil she felt inside. "What looks like failure to one person might actually be something else entirely." Sarah laughed, a sound that had no warmth in it. "That's very diplomatic of you, sis. Very optimistic." She turned to her colleagues with a conspiratorial grin. "Maria has always been the idealistic one in our family. Even as kids, she was always talking about serving others and making a difference. I guess some people never grow out of that phase." The conversation was interrupted by the evening's master of ceremonies, who announced that the hospital's board of directors would be presenting special recognition awards to several major donors and supporters. Maria was grateful for the distraction, hoping it would redirect Sarah's attention away from her personal attacks. As the ceremony began, Maria noticed increased activity among the event staff and security personnel. There was a subtle shift in the room's energy, the kind of change that someone with her training would automatically detect. Additional security guards had positioned themselves near the main entrance, and she could see the discreet earpieces that indicated they were coordinating with someone outside the ballroom. The master of ceremonies called for attention as several distinguished-looking individuals made their way to the stage. Maria recognized some of them from news articles and business publications, but there were others whose faces seemed familiar in a different way. One man in particular, a tall figure with graying hair and a bearing that suggested military background, caught her attention. There was something about his posture and the way he surveyed the room that reminded her of high-ranking officers she had encountered during her service. Sarah, meanwhile, had turned her attention back to Maria with renewed focus. The wine and the encouraging chuckles from some of her colleagues had emboldened her to continue her assault on her sister's dignity. "You know what I really don't understand?" Sarah said, leaning closer to Maria as if sharing a confidence, but speaking loudly enough for the entire table to hear. How someone can spend 6 years in the military and come out with absolutely nothing to show for it. No connections, no valuable skills, no career prospects. I mean, what exactly did you do over there? File paperwork? The question hung in the air like a challenge, and Maria could feel the attention of everyone at the table focused on her. This was the moment Sarah had been building toward all evening, the public humiliation she had orchestrated from the moment she invited Maria to attend the gala. It was a calculated cruelty designed to establish once and for all who was the successful sister and who was the disappointment. Maria looked across the table at Sarah, seeing not just her sister but a representation of everyone who had ever dismissed her service, minimized her sacrifices, or assumed that military experience had no value in the civilian world. For a moment, she considered responding with details about the lives she had saved, the missions she had completed, the recognition she had earned from some of the most respected leaders in the military. But she remained silent, knowing that anything she said would only provide Sarah with more ammunition for her attacks. Instead, Maria simply nodded slightly and said, "Everyone's definition of success is different." It was a response that would prove more prophetic than anyone at the table could possibly imagine. Sarah's question about what Maria had actually accomplished during her military service created a heavy silence at the table. The other guests shifted uncomfortably in their seats, some staring down at their dessert plates, while others exchanged subtle glances that suggested they were witnessing something that had crossed the line from family banter into genuine cruelty. Even in a room full of competitive corporate executives, Sarah's public dismantling of her sister felt unnecessarily harsh. Jennifer Walsh cleared her throat diplomatically. "I think we should probably focus on tonight's cause," she suggested gently. "The Children's Hospital has done such incredible work, especially with their international humanitarian programs," but Sarah was beyond caring about social niceties or appropriate dinner conversation. The combination of wine, professional success, and the audience of her colleagues had created a perfect storm of narcissistic behavior. She waved off Jennifer's attempt to redirect the conversation with a dismissive gesture. No, I think this is actually relevant," Sarah insisted, her voice growing more animated. "I mean, here we are supporting an organization that does real work, that makes actual differences in people's lives. And then you have people who claim to have served their country but have absolutely nothing concrete to show for it." She turned back to Maria with mock concern. "I'm genuinely curious, sis, what exactly was your job over there? Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you spent 6 years playing dress-up and came home with fewer prospects than when you left." The comment drew sharp intakes of breath from several people at the table. David Chen looked genuinely appalled, while Jennifer Walsh's face had gone pale with embarrassment. Even the younger marketing associates, who had been quietly enjoying the drama earlier, now looked uncomfortable with how far Sarah was pushing the confrontation. Maria sat perfectly still, her hands folded in her lap, her breathing controlled and steady. To most observers she appeared calm, perhaps even resigned to her sister's assault. But those with trained eyes might have noticed the subtle changes, the slight straightening of her spine, the way her gaze had become more focused and alert, the barely perceptible shift in her posture that suggested a coiled spring rather than passive acceptance. At that moment, the master of ceremonies on stage called for attention. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have some very special guests with us tonight," he announced, his voice carrying clearly through the ballroom sound system. "I'd like to introduce several members of our hospital's International Medical Advisory Board, including some distinguished military medical personnel who have worked with our humanitarian missions in conflict zones around the world." A group of 5 individuals made their way onto the stage, and Maria's breath caught slightly as she recognized 2 of them immediately. Colonel Patricia Henderson, the commanding officer of the military medical unit Maria had served under in Afghanistan, stood tall and dignified in her dress uniform. Next to her was Dr. Michael Reyes, the chief surgeon who had worked alongside Maria during some of the most challenging medical emergencies in Kandahar province. The sight of her former colleagues brought a flood of memories rushing back. Maria remembered the 18-hour surgeries performed in makeshift operating rooms while mortar fire echoed in the distance. She thought about the civilian casualties they had treated, the local children they had saved, the innovative medical procedures they had developed under impossible conditions. These weren't abstract memories of playing dress-up as Sarah had so cruelly characterized her service. They were life-and-death situations where Maria's skills, training and dedication had made the difference between survival and tragedy for dozens of people. Sarah, oblivious to the significance of the presentation happening on stage, continued her assault. "I mean, let's be honest," she said, gesturing expansively with her wine glass. "If Maria had actually done anything important during her service, don't you think she'd have some kind of career prospects by now? Some connections? Some transferable skill?" She laughed again, that cold sound that had been cutting through Maria's composure all evening. "Instead, she's working security at some office building and living like a college student." The irony of Sarah's timing was lost on her, but not on Maria. As her sister dismissed her military service as meaningless, some of the most respected medical professionals in the world were standing 50 feet away, people who knew exactly what Maria had accomplished and the lives she had saved. The contrast between perception and reality had never been more stark. Jennifer Walsh tried once more to intervene. "Sarah, maybe we should." "Should what?" Sarah interrupted sharply. "Pretend that mediocrity is success. Enable her delusion." She turned back to Maria with a smile that held no warmth. "Look, I love my sister, but someone needs to give her a reality check. You can't coast through life on the idea that you served your country and expect the world to owe you something. At some point you have to actually accomplish something meaningful." That was the moment Maria felt something fundamental shift inside her. It wasn't anger exactly, though anger was certainly part of it. It was more like a door closing on her patience, her willingness to absorb Sarah's cruelty in the name of family peace. The word meaningful echoed in her mind as she thought about the Afghan children whose lives she had saved, the fellow soldiers she had patched up under fire, the medical innovations she had helped develop that were now being used in hospitals around the world. "I see," Maria said quietly, her voice so calm it was almost unsettling. "So in your opinion, what would constitute meaningful accomplishment?" Sarah leaned back in her chair, clearly pleased that she had finally gotten a response. "Well, for starters, a career that actually pays well, financial independence, recognition in your field, contributing to society in a way that people can actually see and measure." She gestured around the ballroom. "Look at everyone here tonight. We're all successful professionals who've built something with our lives. We're supporting important causes, networking with influential people, making a real difference in the world." The master of ceremonies on stage was now introducing each of the military medical personnel individually, sharing highlights of their service and their contributions to international humanitarian efforts. Maria heard Colonel Henderson's introduction, which mentioned her leadership of medical teams in some of the most challenging and dangerous conditions imaginable, and her role in developing life-saving procedures that have revolutionized battlefield medicine. "Real difference," Maria repeated softly, almost to herself. "Exactly," Sarah said, mistaking her sister's quiet tone for agreement. "Real measurable impact. Not just stories about helping people that nobody can verify or that don't lead to anything concrete." She took another sip of wine and leaned forward conspiratorially. "I mean, come on, Maria. If you had really done anything significant over there, don't you think someone would have noticed by now? Don't you think you'd have some kind of recognition or opportunity?" The question hung in the air as Dr. Riaz began speaking into the microphone on stage, his voice carrying clearly through the ballroom's sound system. "Our medical teams in Afghanistan," he was saying, "worked alongside some of the most dedicated and skilled military medical personnel I've ever encountered. Their bravery and expertise saved countless lives under conditions that most people couldn't even imagine." Maria looked at her sister, really looked at her, perhaps for the first time all evening. She saw someone who had built her entire sense of self-worth on external validation, on salary figures and job titles and social status. Someone who genuinely believed that the value of a person's life could be measured by their bank account and their position on an organizational chart. Someone who couldn't conceive of service or sacrifice that didn't come with immediate visible reward. "You're right about one thing, Sarah," Maria said finally, her voice still calm but carrying an undertone that made several people at the table look up from their desserts. "Recognition is important, and sometimes, People do notice meaningful work. As if summoned by her words, Maria noticed a commotion near the main entrance to the ballroom. Additional security personnel had appeared, and there seemed to be some kind of coordination happening between the event staff and the people on stage. The evening, it seemed, was about to take a turn that none of them had anticipated. Sarah, however, was too focused on her victory to notice the changing dynamics around them. "Well, I'm glad you're finally being realistic about your situation," she said with satisfaction. "It's the first step toward actually doing something productive with your life." Those would be the last words Sarah spoke before everything she thought she knew about her sister was turned completely upside down. The transformation in Maria was subtle but unmistakable to anyone who knew what to look for. Her shoulders squared almost imperceptibly, her chin lifted just a fraction, and her eyes took on a clarity and focus that hadn't been there moments before. The quiet, somewhat defeated woman who had been absorbing her sister's attacks was gone, replaced by someone with an entirely different presence. "Sarah," Maria said, her voice cutting through the ambient noise of the ballroom with surprising authority, "I want you to listen very carefully to what's happening on that stage." Something in her tone made not just Sarah but everyone at the table turn their attention to the front of the ballroom. Dr. Reyes had stepped forward to the microphone and was continuing his remarks about the military medical personnel who had served in Afghanistan. "I want to share a story," Dr. Reyes said, his voice carrying the weight of someone who had witnessed extraordinary events. 3 years ago, in a forward operating base in Kandahar province, our medical team faced one of the most challenging situations any of us had ever encountered. A local school had been hit by an improvised explosive device, and we had 43 casualties, most of them children, arriving at our facility within minutes of each other. Sarah started to turn back toward Maria, clearly irritated that her moment of triumph was being interrupted, but Maria held up a hand that somehow commanded attention despite its gentleness. "Listen," Maria said simply. Dr. Reyes continued, his voice growing more emotional as he spoke. "Our surgical facilities were overwhelmed. We had more critical cases than we had operating rooms, more patients than surgeons, and more complex injuries than we had ever dealt with simultaneously. Under normal circumstances, we would have had to make the kind of impossible choices that haunt medical professionals forever." The ballroom had grown quiet as the audience became absorbed in the story. Even Sarah, despite her impatience, found herself drawn into the narrative. "But we had someone on our team," Dr. Reyes said, pausing for effect, "a military surgical specialist, who took charge of the situation with a level of skill and leadership that I have never seen before or since. This person organized our entire response, created a triage system that maximized our resources, and personally performed surgery for 19 consecutive hours." Maria watched as understanding began to dawn in the eyes of some of her tablemates. Jennifer Walsh was looking back and forth between the stage and Maria with a growing expression of amazement. David Chen had stopped eating entirely and was staring at Maria with new recognition. "This surgical specialist," Dr. Reyes continued, "didn't just save lives that day. She revolutionized our entire approach to mass casualty events. The protocols she developed on the spot, under impossible pressure, are now standard procedure in military medical facilities around the world. Her innovations have saved hundreds, possibly thousands of lives since that day." Sarah's wine glass had frozen halfway to her lips. For the first time all evening, she was completely silent, her eyes darting between the stage and her sister as the implications of what she was hearing began to sink in. "But the most remarkable thing," Dr. Reyes said, his voice filled with admiration, "wasn't just her medical skill or her ability to work under pressure. It was her refusal to give up on a single patient. While other medical personnel, myself included, were ready to write off some of the most severely injured children as unsavable, she insisted that we find a way, and because of her determination, because of her innovative techniques and her unwillingness to accept defeat, 41 of those 43 children survived." The ballroom erupted in spontaneous applause, but Maria barely heard it. She was looking directly at Sarah, watching as her sister's face went through a series of expressions: confusion, recognition, disbelief, and finally dawning horror as she realized what she had been saying about her sister's service. "The person I'm talking about," Reyes said as the applause died down, "is someone who embodies everything we hope to achieve in military medicine. Her combination of technical expertise, innovative thinking, and humanitarian dedication represents the very best of what we do." She received the Distinguished Service Cross for her actions that day, one of the highest honors our military can bestow. At that moment, Colonel Henderson stepped forward to the microphone. Her voice was crisp and authoritative as she spoke. "I had the privilege of commanding some of the finest military medical personnel in the world during my time in Afghanistan, but I have never worked with anyone who combined technical brilliance with such genuine compassion for every single patient who came through our door." Maria could see that Sarah was beginning to understand, but the full impact hadn't hit her yet. Her sister's mind was still processing, still trying to reconcile the woman being described on stage with the person she had been systematically humiliating all evening. "This officer," Colonel Henderson continued, "didn't just excel in surgical procedures. She became the person other medical personnel turned to in crisis situations. She trained local medical staff, developed new techniques for treating blast injuries, and created programs that continued to save lives long after her deployment ended." The pieces were falling into place for everyone at the table now. Jennifer Walsh had covered her mouth with her hand, her eyes wide with shock. David Chen was shaking his head in disbelief, clearly remembering every cruel comment Sarah had made throughout the evening. "In my 30 years of military service," Colonel Henderson said, "I have never written a stronger recommendation letter than the one I wrote for this officer. Her combination of surgical skill, leadership ability, and humanitarian dedication made her one of the most valuable members of our entire medical corps." Sarah's face had gone completely pale, the wine glass in her hand was trembling slightly, and she seemed to be having trouble breathing. The confident, successful marketing director who had been holding court all evening looked like she was about to be sick. "Ladies and gentlemen," Colonel Henderson said, her voice carrying across the ballroom with military precision, "tonight we want to recognize not just our International Medical Advisory Board, but also some of the exceptional individuals who served with distinction in our overseas medical missions." Maria could feel the attention of everyone at her table focused intensely on her. The conversations at nearby tables had stopped as people began to piece together what was happening. Sarah's colleagues from Meridian Technologies were looking back and forth between the sisters with expressions ranging from amazement to horror. "It is my great honor," Colonel Henderson continued, "to announce that one of our most distinguished veterans is here with us tonight. Someone who exemplifies the very best of military medical service, and whose innovations continue to save lives around the world." Sarah finally found her voice, though it came out as barely a whisper. "Maria," she said, the name sounding like a question. "They're talking about you." Maria looked at her sister with something that might have been pity. "Recognition is important, Sarah," she said quietly, echoing her sister's earlier words. "And sometimes, people do notice meaningful work." At that moment, as if the evening couldn't become more surreal, Maria noticed movement at the main entrance to the ballroom. Several people were making their way through the crowd, and one of them was Jonathan Pierce, Sarah's CEO, walking with obvious purpose toward their table. The man who had bid $12,000 on a vacation package earlier in the evening now wore an expression of complete astonishment as he approached. Behind him walked two other individuals that Maria recognized. One was the hospital's chief administrator, and the other was someone she hadn't expected to see tonight. Sarah followed Maria's gaze and saw her boss approaching their table, but she was too stunned by the revelations from the stage to process what this might mean. The evening that had started with her systematic humiliation of her sister was about to reach a conclusion that would change everything she thought she knew about success, recognition, and the value of service. The moment of truth was finally at hand. Jonathan Pierce approached the table with the stride of a man who had built a multi-million-dollar company from nothing, but there was something different about his demeanor now. The confident CEO who had commanded the charity auction earlier in the evening looked almost nervous, his usual corporate composure replaced by something that resembled genuine emotion. The revelations from the stage had left her reeling, but she still couldn't fully process what was happening. The sister she had spent the evening mocking as a failure was apparently some kind of decorated war hero, and now her CEO was walking directly toward their table with an expression she had never seen before. "Excuse me," Jonathan said as he reached their table, his voice carrying a reverence that was completely at odds with his usual corporate authority. "I'm sorry to interrupt, but I couldn't help but notice." He paused, looking directly at Maria with an expression that could only be described as awe. "Are you Dr. Maria Thompson?" The use of her title sent another shock wave through the table. Dr. Thompson, not just Maria, not just a veteran, but Dr. Thompson. Sarah's mouth opened slightly as she realized that she hadn't even known her sister held a doctoral degree. Maria nodded quietly. "Yes, Mr. Pierce, though I haven't used that title much since leaving the service." "My God," Jonathan breathed, and then, to the absolute astonishment of everyone at the table, the CEO of Meridian Technologies slowly bowed his head in respect. "Dr. Thompson, it is an incredible honor to meet you." The gesture sent ripples of shock through not just their table but the surrounding area. Other guests had begun to notice the unusual scene, and conversations were stopping as people turned to see what was happening. Sarah felt as though the ground was shifting beneath her feet as she watched her boss, one of the most powerful men in the city, showing deference to the sister she had been humiliating all evening. "Mr. Pierce," Maria said gently, "there's no need for that. Please." But Jonathan remained standing with his head bowed for a moment longer before straightening up. "Dr. Thompson, my daughter Emma was one of the children you saved in Kandahar." The words hit the table like a physical blow. Sarah felt her wine glass slip from her nerveless fingers, the remaining liquid spilling across the white tablecloth unnoticed. Jennifer Walsh gasped audibly, while David Chen simply stared in open-mouthed disbelief. "Emma Pierce," Maria said softly, recognition dawning in her eyes. "The little girl with the compound fracture and internal bleeding." She was. Maria paused, her professional composure softening as she remembered. "She was so brave. She kept asking if her friends were okay while we were operating." Jonathan's eyes filled with tears. "She's 14 now, healthy, happy, about to start high school." His voice broke slightly. "The doctors at the German hospital where you stabilized her said she wouldn't have survived another hour without the surgery you performed. They said what you did, operating under those conditions with limited resources, was nothing short of miraculous." The conversation around their table had stopped entirely. Other guests were openly staring now, some pulling out their phones to record what was clearly an extraordinary moment. Sarah sat frozen in her chair, watching as the successful, powerful CEO of her company spoke to her sister with the kind of reverence usually reserved for saints or heads of state. "Emma talks about you all the time," Jonathan continued, his voice stronger now but still thick with emotion. "She calls you her guardian angel. When she found out you were from Philadelphia, she made me promise that if I ever met you I would tell you that she became a volunteer with the Children's Hospital because of what you did for her." Maria's professional composure finally cracked, and tears began to stream down her cheeks. "How is she?" "Really? The last I heard, she was being transferred to Germany for additional surgery." "She's perfect," Jonathan said, pulling out his phone and scrolling through photos. "She plays soccer, she's learning 3 languages, and she wants to become a doctor because of you." He showed Maria a recent photo of a beautiful teenage girl in a soccer uniform, smiling broadly at the camera. "She's everything a father could hope for, and she's alive because of your skill and dedication." The silence at the table was deafening. Sarah felt as though she was watching the scene from outside her own body, unable to process the complete reversal of everything she thought she knew. The sister she had described as having nothing to show for her military service had literally saved the life of her boss's daughter. The woman she had mocked for her lack of connections was personally known to one of the most influential men in the city. "Thompson," Jonathan said, his voice taking on the tone of someone making an important business proposition. "I know this might not be the appropriate time or place, but Meridian Technologies has been looking for someone to head our new medical technology division. We're developing surgical robotics and battlefield medical equipment for military and civilian applications." He paused, looking directly into Maria's eyes. "I can't think of anyone more qualified than someone who has actually used these technologies to save lives under the most challenging conditions imaginable." Sarah felt the world tilt on its axis. Her boss was offering her sister a job, not just any job, but what sounded like a senior executive position at one of the city's most successful companies. The sister she had described as unemployable was being recruited by a CEO who clearly viewed her as invaluable. "The position comes with a substantial salary, full benefits, and equity in the company," Jonathan continued. "But more than that, it would allow you to take the innovations you developed in the field and bring them to medical facilities around the world. You could save even more lives." Maria looked around the table, her gaze settling briefly on Sarah before returning to Jonathan. "That's very generous, Mr. Pierce. I would need to think about it, of course." "Of course," Jonathan agreed quickly. "Take all the time you need. But please know that this offer comes not just from a CEO looking for talent, but from a father who will be forever grateful for what you did for his daughter." At that moment, Colonel Henderson's voice came over the sound system again. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have a special surprise tonight. One of our most distinguished veterans, Dr. Maria Thompson, is here with us this evening. Dr. Thompson, would you please join us on stage?" The spotlight found their table bathing Maria in bright light as applause began to build throughout the ballroom. Jonathan Pierce began clapping enthusiastically, as did Jennifer Walsh and David Chen. Gradually the entire room rose in a standing ovation, as Maria stood up from her chair. Sarah remained seated, watching in stunned silence as her sister walked toward the stage with the dignity and bearing of someone who had earned every bit of recognition she was receiving. The woman she had spent the evening describing as a failure was being honored by hundreds of the city's most successful and influential people. As Maria reached the stage and was embraced by Colonel Henderson and Dr. Riaz, Sarah finally understood the full magnitude of what she had done. She had publicly humiliated someone who had saved dozens of lives, including the daughter of her own boss. She had mocked and belittled a decorated war hero who had earned recognition from some of the most respected people in the military and medical community. The standing ovation continued as Maria stepped up to the microphone, her quiet dignity commanding the respect of everyone in the ballroom. As she began to speak about the importance of supporting the Children's Hospital and honoring all those who serve others, Sarah realized that her sister had never needed her approval or validation. Maria had been successful all along. She had just been successful in ways that truly mattered, in ways that Sarah had been too narrow-minded and self-absorbed to recognize. The question wasn't whether Maria would ever amount to anything. The question was whether Sarah would ever amount to anything close to what her sister had already achieved. The evening that had started with Sarah's cruel assessment of her sister's worth was ending with the entire room recognizing Maria as exactly what she had always been. A hero whose quiet service had made the world a better place, one life at a time. As the applause finally died down and Maria began to speak, Sarah sat alone at the table surrounded by colleagues who now looked at her with expressions ranging from pity to disgust, finally understanding that the only failure in the Thompson family had been her ability to recognize greatness when it was sitting right across from her. The ballroom had finally returned to its normal level of conversation, but the energy in the room had fundamentally shifted. Maria's speech about service, sacrifice and the importance of supporting organizations like the Children's Hospital had been met with thunderous applause and a wave of additional donations that exceeded the evening's fundraising goals by nearly 40%. People were still approaching her table to introduce themselves, shake her hand and share their own stories of military service or family members who had been helped by similar medical programs. Sarah sat at the table like a statue watching the parade of accomplished individuals who wanted to speak with her sister. Corporate executives, retired military officers, prominent physicians, and influential philanthropists all treated Maria with the kind of respect that Sarah had spent years trying to earn through her marketing achievement. The contrast between her sister's genuine recognition and her own professional validation felt stark and humbling. Jennifer Walsh had quietly moved her chair closer to Maria's empty seat, clearly hoping to continue the conversation when Maria returned from her latest round of introduction. David Chen was already exchanging business cards with a retired Navy admiral who had stopped by to share stories about military medical innovation. The rest of Sarah's colleagues from Meridian Technologies seemed to have forgotten she existed entirely, their attention completely captured by the extraordinary revelation of who Maria really was. "Sarah," came a voice from behind her, and she turned to see Jonathan Pierce approaching once again. This time, however, his expression was markedly different from the reverence he had shown Maria. His face wore the look of a CEO who had just witnessed one of his senior employees publicly humiliating a person he held in the highest regard. "Miss Pierce," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. She had been dreading this conversation, knowing that her behavior throughout the evening had been witnessed not just by her colleagues, but by the one person whose opinion could make or break her career. "I think we need to have a conversation," Jonathan said quietly, his tone professional but unmistakably serious. "Perhaps we could step outside for a moment." Sarah nodded mutely, and followed her boss toward the ballroom's exit. Feeling the eyes of her colleagues tracking their movement, she caught Jennifer's expression as they passed, and the mixture of embarrassment and disapproval she saw there confirmed her worst fears about how the evening's events were being perceived. The convention center's lobby was quieter, though still populated with gala attendees who were beginning to make their departure. Jonathan led Sarah to a seating area near the large windows that overlooked the city, his silence during the walk giving her too much time to contemplate how drastically her life was about to change. "Sit down, Sarah," Jonathan said, and she complied immediately, feeling like a child being called to the principal's office. The CEO remained standing for a moment, looking out at the city lights before turning his attention back to her. "I've known you for 3 years," he began, his voice measured and controlled. "In that time I've watched you develop into one of our most effective marketing directors. Your campaigns have been creative, your client relationships strong, and your results consistently impressive." He paused, and Sarah felt a brief flicker of hope that perhaps her professional track record might somehow offset the evening's catastrophe. "But tonight," Jonathan continued, "I watched you systematically humiliate and belittle someone who saved my daughter's life, someone who has accomplished more in service to others than most people achieve in entire careers." His voice remained steady, but Sarah could hear the controlled anger beneath his professional demeanor. "Mr. Pierce, eyes," Sarah began, but he held up a hand to stop her. "I'm not finished," he said firmly. "What disturbs me most isn't just that you were cruel to your sister, it's that you demonstrated a fundamental lack of character and judgment that makes me question everything I thought I knew about you." He sat down across from her, leaning forward slightly. "You made assumptions about someone's worth based on superficial measures of success. You publicly attacked someone without knowing anything about their actual accomplishments, and you did it with a level of cruelty that was genuinely shocking to witness." Sarah felt tears beginning to form in her eyes, but she forced herself to maintain eye contact with her boss. She knew that anything she said now would sound like excuses or self-serving justification. "Here's what's going to happen," Jonathan continued. "You're going to take a leave of absence effective immediately. I want you to think long and hard about your values, your character, and what kind of person you want to be." He stood up again, straightening his suit jacket. "When you come back, if you come back, I expect to see evidence that you've learned something from tonight. Real evidence, not just words." "How long?" Sarah managed to ask, her voice cracking slightly. "As long as it takes," Jonathan replied. "This isn't a vacation, Sarah. This is an opportunity for you to figure out who you really are, and whether that person has a place at Meridian Technology." He looked down at her with an expression that might have been disappointment or pity. "Your sister could have destroyed you tonight. She could have humiliated you in front of everyone, made you look as small as you tried to make her look, but she didn't. Do you understand?" Sarah shook her head, not trusting her voice to respond verbally. "Because she has character," Jonathan said simply. "Because she understands what really matters in life. Because she's spent years in situations where people's lives depended on her ability to stay focused on what's important, rather than petty personal grievances." He turned to leave, then paused. I suggest you spend your time off figuring out how to develop even a fraction of her strength of character. As Jonathan walked away, Sarah remained sitting in the lobby chair, feeling more alone than she had ever felt in her life. Through the ballroom doors, she could hear the continuing sounds of conversation and laughter as the gala wound down. Her sister was still in there, still surrounded by people who respected and admired her, still graciously accepting congratulations and sharing stories about her service. 20 minutes later, Maria emerged from the ballroom, looking tired but genuinely happy in a way that Sarah hadn't seen in years. She spotted her sister in the lobby and walked over, her expression kind but guarded. "Are you ready to go?" Maria asked simply. Sarah looked up at her sister, seeing her clearly for perhaps the first time in years. The woman standing before her wasn't the failure she had spent the evening describing. She was someone who had earned the highest military decorations, saved dozens of lives, innovated medical procedures that were still being used around the world, and commanded the respect of everyone from CEOs to generals. She was someone who had every right to be angry, vindictive, or cruel in return for the treatment she had received. "Maria," Sarah said, her voice barely audible, "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." Maria studied her sister's face for a long moment before responding. "I know you are," she said quietly, "but sorry isn't enough anymore. Sarah, we both need to decide what kind of relationship we want to have going forward." "I want to try again," Sarah said, the words tumbling out desperately. "I want to be better. I want to understand who you really are instead of making assumptions. I want to be the kind of sister you deserve." Maria nodded slowly. "Then we'll try," she said. "But it's going to take time, and it's going to take real change, not just words." As they walked toward the exit together, Sarah realized that the evening had ended everything she thought she knew about success, family, and what it meant to make a meaningful contribution to the world. Her sister had never needed to amount to anything because she already had. The only question now was whether Sarah could find a way to amount to something herself, something real and worthy of the respect she had always craved but never truly earned. The night that had begun with Sarah's cruel assessment of her sister's failures was ending with the recognition that the only failure that truly mattered was her own inability to see the extraordinary person who had been sitting across from her all along. But perhaps, with time and genuine effort, that failure didn't have to be permanent. 6 months after the charity gala that changed everything, Maria Thompson stood in the gleaming conference room on the 15th floor of Meridian Technologies, looking out at the Philadelphia skyline through floor-to-ceiling windows. The view was spectacular, but what struck her most was how different her life had become since that pivotal evening. The modest studio apartment had been replaced by a comfortable townhouse in Society Hill, and the simple black dress from the gala now hung in a closet, full of professional attire, befitting her new role as Chief Medical Officer of Meridian's Medical Technology Division. The transformation hadn't been immediate. After accepting Jonathan Pierce's offer, Maria had spent weeks developing her vision for the division, drawing on her field experience to identify the most critical needs in both military and civilian medical settings. Her first major project had been the development of a portable surgical suite that could be deployed in disaster zones or remote locations, bringing the innovations she had pioneered in Afghanistan to places where they could save even more lives. "Dr. Thompson," came a voice from the doorway. Maria turned to see Emma Pierce, now 15 and volunteering at the company as part of a summer program for high school students. The young woman bore little resemblance to the critically injured child Maria remembered from that chaotic day in Kandahar, but her eyes held the same determined spirit that had impressed Maria even in those desperate circumstances. "Emma," Maria smiled warmly. "How's the internship going?" "It's amazing," Emma replied, stepping into the conference room. "I'm working with the marketing team on the presentation for your new field hospital prototype. They want to make sure they get all the technical details right." She paused, her expression becoming more serious. "Thompson, I wanted to thank you again. I know I've said it before, but I don't think I can say it enough." Maria shook her head gently. "Emma, you don't need to keep thanking me. I was just doing my job. No, Emma said firmly, with the conviction that only teenagers can muster. You saved my life, and not just in the medical sense. You gave me a future. Because of you, I'm going to be pre-med at Stanford next year. Because of you, I know what I want to do with my life. The conversation was interrupted by a soft knock on the conference room door. Maria looked up to see Sarah standing uncertainly in the doorway, holding 2 cups of coffee and looking nothing like the confident marketing director she had been 6 months earlier. The mandatory leave of absence had lasted 4 months, during which Sarah had undergone professional counseling, volunteered at a veterans rehabilitation center, and attended family therapy sessions with Maria. I brought coffee, Sarah said quietly. I thought we could talk before the board presentation. Maria nodded and gestured to the chairs around the conference table. The relationship between the sisters had been slowly rebuilding over the past few months, but it remained fragile, built on a foundation of genuine remorse from Sarah and cautious forgiveness from Maria. Emma excused herself, but not before giving Sarah a polite nod of acknowledgement. The teenager's relationship with Sarah had been one of the more challenging aspects of the aftermath. When Emma learned that Sarah was the sister who had publicly humiliated the woman who saved her life, her reaction had been swift and unforgiving. It had taken months of patient explanation from both Maria and her father before Emma was willing to even speak to Sarah civilly. "How are you feeling about today?" Sarah asked as she settled into her chair. Her role at Meridian had changed significantly upon her return. She was no longer a senior marketing director but worked in a support capacity, focusing on veteran outreach programs and community relations. The salary reduction and loss of status had been difficult, but Sarah had accepted it as part of her effort to rebuild not just her career but her character. "Nervous," Maria admitted. "The board presentation is important, but it's more than. If they approve the full funding for the mobile surgical units, we'll be able to deploy them to disaster zones around the world within 18 months. Sarah nodded, sipping her coffee thoughtfully. "The preliminary reports from the pilot program have been incredible. The unit you tested in Puerto Rico after Hurricane Elena saved 17 lives in the first week alone." It was true. The prototype mobile surgical suite had exceeded even Maria's optimistic projection. The combination of cutting-edge technology and field-tested procedures had created something revolutionary in emergency medicine. International relief organizations were already requesting units, and the Pentagon had expressed interest in deploying them with military medical teams. "I've been thinking about that night," Sarah said suddenly, her voice barely above a whisper. "About what I said to you, how I treated you." She looked down at her hands, still clearly struggling with the memory. "I keep wondering how you managed to stay so calm, so dignified, when I was saying such horrible things." Maria considered the question carefully. "Afghanistan taught me a lot about what really matters," she said finally. "When you've held dying children in your arms, when you've watched friends make the ultimate sacrifice for strangers, when you've had to make life and death decisions with incomplete information and limited resources." She paused, searching for the right word. "It puts everything else in perspective. Your opinion of my career prospects didn't seem very important, compared to the lives I'd helped save. But I'm your sister," Sarah said, her voice cracking slightly. "My opinion should have mattered to you." "It did matter," Maria replied gently. "That's why it hurt. But I learned in the military that you can't control what other people think or say about you. You can only control how you respond to it." The door opened again, and Jonathan Pierce entered the conference room, followed by 3 members of Meridian's board of directors. The time for personal conversation was over. The business of changing the world was about to begin. "Dr. Thompson," Jonathan said with a smile, "are you ready to make history?" As Maria stood to begin her presentation, she caught Sarah's eye across the table. Her sister gave her a small nod of encouragement, and for the first time since that terrible night at the gala, Maria saw something in Sarah's expression that looked like genuine pride. Not the competitive, status-driven pride that had fueled their sibling rivalry for years, but the simple, honest pride of someone who finally understood what real accomplishment looked like. The presentation went flawlessly. The board approved full funding for the mobile surgical suite program, along with authorization to begin development of 2 additional medical technologies that Maria had proposed. By the end of the meeting, Meridian Technologies had committed to investing $50 million in Maria's vision for revolutionizing emergency medicine. As the board members filed out, discussing implementation timelines and market strategies, Jonathan approached Maria with an expression of deep satisfaction. "Congratulations, Dr. Thompson," he said, shaking her hand formally before pulling her into a brief paternal hug. "Emma is going to be so proud when she hears about this. We all are." After everyone had left, Maria and Sarah found themselves alone in the conference room once again. The late afternoon sun was casting long shadows across the polished table, and the city below was beginning to show the first hints of evening lighting. "Maria," Sarah said, her voice thick with emotion, "I know I can never fully make up for what I did that night, but I want you to know that watching you today, seeing what you've accomplished, understanding who you really are," she paused, wiping away a tear, "I'm proud to be your sister, even if I don't deserve to be." Maria looked at Sarah for a long moment, seeing not the cruel, competitive woman from the gala, but someone who had genuinely worked to become better, to understand what really mattered in life. The journey hadn't been easy for either of them, but perhaps that made the destination more meaningful. "We're family, Sarah," Maria said simply. "That means we don't give up on each other, even when we fail each other, especially then." As they prepared to leave the conference room, Maria's phone buzzed with a text message from Emma. "Dad told me about the board meeting. You're going to save so many lives with this program. Thank you for never giving up on helping people, even when people don't appreciate what you do." Maria showed the message to Sarah, who read it with a mixture of admiration and regret. The contrast between Emma's immediate recognition of Maria's worth and Sarah's own blindness that night remained a painful reminder of how much damage assumptions and prejudice could cause. But it was also a reminder of something else, that people could change, that relationships could heal, and that sometimes the most profound transformations came from the most difficult circumstance. The night that had nearly destroyed their sisterhood had ultimately become the foundation for building something stronger and more authentic than what they had before. As they walked toward the elevator together, Maria reflected on the strange journey that had brought her from a gas station charity gala to a corporate boardroom, from being dismissed as a failure to being recognized as a visionary leader. The external changes were significant, but the internal transformation, both her own and Sarah's, was perhaps even more remarkable. The woman who had once been told she would never amount to anything was now positioned to save thousands of lives around the world. But more importantly, she had learned that her worth had never been determined by other people's recognition of it. She had always been exactly who she was meant to be. It had just taken the rest of the world a little longer to know. 2 years after the charity gala that changed everything, Maria Thompson stood in a military tent in northern Kenya, her hands moving with practiced precision as she worked to save the life of a 7-year-old boy who had been injured in a flash flood that devastated his village. The mobile surgical unit hummed quietly around her, its advanced technology seamlessly integrated into a deployment that would have been impossible just a few years earlier. "Vitals are stabilizing," Dr. Thompson reported Lieutenant Sarah Kim, a young Army medic who was part of the joint civilian-military relief mission. The irony of working with another Sarah wasn't lost on Maria, though this Sarah possessed all the dedication and competence that her sister had initially lacked. Through the tent's clear panels, Maria could see the controlled chaos of the disaster relief operation. Meridian Technologies' mobile surgical units had been deployed in 12 countries over the past 18 months, saving over 3,000 lives in natural disasters, conflict zones, and remote areas where traditional medical care was impossible. Each deployment validated the vision Maria had developed from her experience in Afghanistan, proving that innovation born from necessity could transform medicine around the world. "Dr. Thompson," came a familiar voice from the tent's entrance. Maria looked up to see Colonel Patricia Henderson, now retired but serving as a consultant for international medical relief operations. "I hate to interrupt, but we have visitors." Maria carefully transferred the young patient's care to Dr. Kim and stepped outside the surgical tent. The afternoon sun in northern Kenya was intense, but she had grown accustomed to working in challenging environments over the past 2 years. What she saw, however, made her stop in her tracks. Standing near the command center, looking somewhat out of place in their business attire despite the dust and heat, were Jonathan Pierce and Sarah, Her sister appeared nervous but determined, carrying a large duffel bag that seemed oddly familiar. "What are you two doing here?" Maria asked as she approached, genuinely surprised to see them in this remote location. "We brought you something," Jonathan said with a smile that seemed to hold special significance, and Sarah insisted on delivering it personally. Sarah stepped forward, her expression more serious than Maria had seen in months. "Maria, I know this might seem strange, coming all the way to Kenya just to give you something, but," she paused, seeming to struggle with her words. "What you're doing here, what you've been doing everywhere with these mobile units, it's incredible, but I realized you've been carrying something with you all this time that you shouldn't have to carry anymore." She unzipped the duffel bag and carefully removed a folded American flag. But this wasn't just any flag. Maria recognized it immediately. It was the flag that had been draped over the coffin of Sergeant Michael Torres, one of her closest friends who had died in an IED explosion during her final deployment. Maria had carried it with her ever since, a reminder of the cost of service and the responsibility she felt to honor those who hadn't made it home. "How did you know about this?" Maria asked quietly, her voice thick with emotion. "You mentioned him once, during one of our therapy sessions," Sarah said softly. "You said you kept his flag because you felt like you owed it to him to make your life count for something. But Maria, you've done that. You've saved more lives with these mobile units than anyone could have imagined. You've trained hundreds of medical personnel. You've revolutionized emergency medicine." She held out the flag with trembling hands. "I think it's time to let Mike rest." Maria felt tears streaming down her cheeks as she accepted the flag. The weight of it, both physical and emotional, was something she had carried for so long that she had forgotten what it felt like to set it down. "There's more," Jonathan said gently. "The Department of Defense has officially adopted your mobile surgical unit design for all forward medical operations. The Secretary of Defense wants to present you with the Medal for Distinguished Public Service next month. And," he paused, clearly enjoying the moment, "the United Nations has asked you to head their new Global Emergency Medical Response Initiative." Maria looked at the flag in her hands, then at the surgical tent where her patient was recovering, then at the faces of Sarah and Jonathan who had traveled halfway around the world to share this moment with her. The journey from that humiliating night at the charity gala to this moment seemed impossible to believe, yet here she was. "There's something else," Sarah said, reaching into her jacket pocket. "I've been working on this for months." She pulled out a thick fold. "It's a proposal for the Michael Torres Foundation. We want to provide full medical school scholarships for veterans who want to become emergency physicians. Jonathan has agreed to fund the first 50 scholarships." Maria stared at the folder, overwhelmed by the thought and planning that had gone into honoring her fallen friend. "Sarah, I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything," Sarah replied. "You've already said everything that matters through your work, your service, your example." She looked around at the relief operation, at the lives being saved, at the technology that had emerged from her sister's vision and experience. "I spent so many years thinking success was about salary and status and impressing other people, but watching you, seeing what you've accomplished, understanding what real impact looks like," she shook her head in amazement. "You've shown me what it actually means to amount to something." As if summoned by their conversation, Emma Pierce appeared from behind one of the supply tents, now 17, and spending her gap year before Stanford volunteering with international relief organizations. She had grown into a confident young woman, whose desire to serve others was clearly inspired by the woman who had saved her life. "Dr. Thompson," Emma called out excitedly, "the boy you operated on is awake and asking for you. He wants to thank the lady doctor who fixed him." Maria looked at the flag in her hands one more time, then carefully folded it and placed it in the duffel bag. She would take it home, but not as a burden to carry anymore. Instead, it would become part of the foundation that would help other veterans find their own ways to serve and heal. "Lead the way, Emma," Maria said, wiping away her tears and straightening her shoulders. "Let's go see our patient." As they walked toward the surgical tent together, Maria, Sarah, Jonathan, and Emma, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the refugee camp. In those shadows, Maria could almost see the ghosts of everyone who had brought her to this moment: Sergeant Torres, and the other friends she had lost, the patients she had saved, the family members who had doubted her, and the sister who had learned to believe in her. The young boy who was waiting for her in the tent didn't know that the woman who had saved his life had once been told she would never amount to anything. He didn't know about the long journey from public humiliation to international recognition, or the personal struggles and professional triumphs that had brought her to his bedside. All he knew was that when he was hurt and scared, someone had cared enough to help. In the end, Maria realized that was what amounting to something really meant, not the awards or recognition or career advancement, but the simple act of using whatever gifts you had been given to make life better for someone else. She had been doing that all along, from the first day she put on a military uniform, to this moment in a refugee camp in Kenya. The world had just taken a while to note. As she entered the tent to check on her young patient, Maria smiled at the thought that somewhere out there, another young person who felt overlooked or undervalued, might see her story and realize that their worth wasn't determined by other people's recognition of it. Sometimes the most important work happened in the shadows, and sometimes the people who seemed to amount to nothing were actually changing the world, one life at a time. The boy's face lit up when he saw her, and in that moment, Maria knew with absolute certainty that she had amounted to exactly what she was meant to be, someone who never stopped fighting for others, no matter who was watching or who understood the significance of her work. That, she thought, was a legacy worth carrying forward. 5 years after the charity gala that changed everything, Maria Thompson found herself standing once again in the grand ballroom of the Riverside Convention Center. The annual Children's Hospital of Philadelphia fundraising gala had grown significantly since that fateful night, now attracting international attention and support from medical professionals around the world. But tonight was different. Tonight, Maria was the keynote speaker, and the theme of the evening was Hidden Heroes, recognizing unsung service in our community. The ballroom looked much the same as it had 5 years ago, with its crystal chandeliers and elegant table settings, but the energy was entirely different. Where once Maria had sat quietly at table 12 feeling out of place and undervalued, now she stood at the podium wearing the insignia of her new role as Director of Global Emergency Medical Response for the United Nations, addressing an audience that included heads of state, Nobel laureates, and leaders from every major humanitarian organization in the world. 5 years ago, Maria began, her voice carrying clearly through the sound system to every corner of the ballroom. I sat in this very room at table 12, listening to my sister tell me that I would never amount to anything. A murmur of recognition rippled through the audience. Many of them had heard this story before, as it had become something of a legend in military and medical circles. In the front row, Sarah sat with tears already streaming down her cheek. She was now the executive director of the Michael Torres Foundation, which had grown from those first 50 medical scholarships into a comprehensive program that had sent over 800 veterans through medical school. Beside her sat Jonathan Pierce, still CEO of Meridian Technologies, which had become the world's leading manufacturer of emergency medical equipment, largely based on innovations stemming from Maria's work. I want to tell you about that night, Maria continued, not because I hold any grudges. Time has a way of putting even our most painful experiences into perspective, but because it taught me something crucial about how we measure worth and recognize value in our society. At table 12, now designated as the Table of Honor, where families of fallen service members were seated as special guests, sat Mrs. Elena Torres, the mother of Sergeant Michael Torres. She clutched a program that featured her son's photograph alongside information about the foundation bearing his name. Next to her was Lieutenant Sarah Kim, the young medic who had worked with Maria in Kenya and was now completing her residency in emergency medicine through a Torres Foundation scholarship. That night I was dismissed as a failure because I didn't have the external markers of success that our society has trained us to recognize, Maria said. I didn't have a prestigious job title, a 6-figure salary, or a downtown lot. What I did have were experiences, skills, and a commitment to service that couldn't be measured by traditional metrics. The audience listened in absolute silence, many of them thinking about people in their own lives whose value they might have overlooked or underestimated. Since that night, the mobile surgical units developed through Meridian Technologies have been deployed in 47 countries. They've saved over 12,000 lives in natural disasters, conflict zones, and remote areas, where traditional medical care was impossible. The Torres Foundation has graduated its first class of veteran physicians, who are now serving in underserved communities around the world, and the innovations we pioneered in field medicine have been adopted by every major relief organization and military medical unit on Earth. At another table, Emma Pierce, now a senior at Stanford Medical School and already accepted into a prestigious emergency medicine residency, wiped away tears as she listened to the woman who had not only saved her life, but inspired her career path. Next to her sat Colonel Patricia Henderson, now retired but serving as a board member for 3 different humanitarian organizations. "But here's what I want you to understand," Maria said, her voice growing stronger. "None of that makes me more valuable than I was on that night 5 years ago. My worth as a human being wasn't determined by awards or recognition or career advancement. It was determined by the same thing that determines all of our worth: our commitment to using whatever gifts we have to serve something larger than ourselves." She paused, looking out at the audience with the same calm dignity she had maintained through her sister's attacks all those years ago. "In this room tonight, there are probably dozens of people whose true value is hidden from those around them. The administrative assistant, who volunteers at homeless shelters on weekends, the security guard who's putting himself through nursing school, the janitor who's raising 3 kids as a single parent while caring for elderly parents, the quiet colleague who spends vacation time building homes for disaster victims." The audience began to shift uncomfortably as many recognized themselves or people they knew in these descriptions. "We live in a culture that celebrates the visible and the vocal, that equates net worth with human worth, that assumes influence equals impact. But some of the most important work in our world is done by people you'll never see on magazine covers, people whose names will never be in headlines, people who measure success not by what they accumulate, but by what they contribute." Maria's eyes found Sarah in the front row, and she offered her sister a smile of genuine affection and forgiveness. "My sister Sarah taught me something important that night, though it wasn't what she intended to teach. She showed me how easy it is to make assumptions about people based on superficial evidence, how quickly we can dismiss someone's value when we don't understand their story, how much damage we can do when we confuse external circumstances with internal worth." Sarah nodded through her tears, having spent 5 years working to make amends not just with Maria but with her own understanding of what truly mattered in life. "But she also taught me something else, something more hopeful. She showed me that people can change, that relationships can heal, that even our most painful failures can become the foundation for growth and redemption." Maria's voice softened with emotion. "Today my sister runs a foundation that has transformed hundreds of lives. She found her own way to amount to something meaningful, and she did it by learning to see value in others that she had previously overlooked." The applause that followed was spontaneous and sustained, but Maria held up her hand to continue. "So tonight, as we celebrate the incredible work of this hospital and the countless lives it has touched, I want to challenge each of you to look around your own lives with new eyes. Who are the hidden heroes in your workplace, your neighborhood, your family? Whose value have you overlooked because it doesn't fit conventional definitions of success? Whose contributions have you dismissed because they don't come with the right credentials or the right titles?" She looked directly at table 12 where Miss Torres was holding the program photo of her son. "Every person in this room has the potential to save lives, to change communities, to make a difference that echoes through generations. You don't need special training or unique talent. You just need the willingness to see others clearly and to use whatever gifts you have in service of something larger than yourself." As Maria concluded her speech and the audience rose in a standing ovation that lasted nearly 5 minutes, she thought about the journey that had brought her from that painful night of humiliation to this moment of recognition and purpose. The external changes were remarkable, from unemployed veteran to UN director, from unknown to internationally recognized leader. But the internal journey was perhaps even more significant, from carrying the burden of others' limited expectations, to understanding that her worth had never been dependent on their recognition. As she stepped down from the podium and was immediately surrounded by admirers and well-wishers, Maria caught sight of a young woman in a simple dress sitting at one of the back tables, looking overwhelmed and out of place. The woman was clearly military. Maria could tell by her posture and the careful way she observed her surroundings, and she appeared to be struggling with the transition to civilian life. Without hesitation, Maria excused herself from the crowd of dignitaries and made her way to the back of the ballroom. She had learned over the years that the most important conversations often happened not with the powerful and prominent, but with those who felt unseen and undervalued. "Excuse me," Maria said gently, approaching the young woman's table. "I'm Maria Thompson. Mind if I sit down for a moment?" The young woman looked up with surprise and recognition. "Dr. Thompson, I'm Captain Jessica Martinez. I just got back from my third deployment in Syria. I'm not sure why I'm here, honestly. My roommate thought it would be good for me to get out." And Maria sat down without waiting for an invitation. "Tell me about your service, Jessica. What did you do over there?" And as the conversation swirled around them, and the gala continued its celebration of hidden heroes, Maria did what she had always done best. She listened, she understood, and she helped someone else realize that their worth was not determined by other people's recognition of it. The circle was complete, but the story, Maria knew, would continue as long as there were people willing to see value in unexpected places, and to use their gifts in service of others. That was what it truly meant to amount to something, and it was a lesson worth passing on. 10 years after that fateful charity gala, the story of Maria Thompson had become something larger than any single person's experience. It had evolved into a movement, a way of thinking about human potential and hidden value that had spread far beyond the medical community or military circles. But Maria herself remained focused on the work, standing now in a refugee camp in Bangladesh where monsoon floods had displaced over 2 million people. The mobile surgical unit that hummed around her was the fifth generation of the design she had pioneered, now so advanced that it could perform operations that would have been impossible in the best hospitals just a decade earlier. But what struck her most as she worked to repair the complex injuries of a young mother who had been caught in a building collapse was not the technology, but the team around her. Dr. Jessica Martinez, the young veteran Maria had met at the gala 5 years earlier, now served as Chief of Emergency Medicine for the UN's Rapid Response Medical Teams. Lieutenant Commander David Park, a Navy medic whose transition to civilian life had been eased by the Torres Foundation, managed the surgical support systems with the precision of someone who had found his calling. And Captain Rebecca Santos, a former Air Force pararescue specialist who had retrained as a surgeon through the Foundation's advanced programs, led the trauma response team with the kind of calm authority that only came from saving lives under fire. "Vitals are stable, Dr. Thompson," Martinez reported, her voice carrying the confidence of someone who had found her place in the world. "The internal repairs are holding beautifully." Maria smiled as she worked, thinking about how the young woman who had felt lost and purposeless at that gala 5 years ago had become one of the most respected emergency physicians in international relief medicine. It was a transformation that had been repeated hundreds of times over as the Torres Foundation and its partner organizations had helped veterans translate their military experience into civilian careers focused on service. "Thompson," came a voice from the tent's entrance, and Maria looked up to see Emma Pierce, now Dr. Emma Pierce, having completed her emergency medicine residency and joined the UN Medical Response Team. At 22, she possessed the kind of mature competence that came from having been saved by, and then trained by, the best in the field. "What is it, Emma?" Maria asked, not pausing in her work. "We have a visitor," Emma said, her voice carrying a note of something that sounded like awe. "The Secretary General is here, and she's asking to speak with you personally." Maria finished the procedure she was performing, carefully transferred the patient's care to Dr. Martinez, and stepped outside the surgical tent. The afternoon heat in Bangladesh was intense, but she had long since grown accustomed to working in challenging environments around the world. What she saw, however, made her pause in genuine surprise. Standing near the command center was not just the UN Secretary General but a small delegation that included the President of Bangladesh, the Director General of the World Health Organization, and several other officials whose presence indicated something significant was happening. "Thompson," the Secretary General said, as Maria approached, "thank you for taking time from your critical work. I know how valuable every moment is in a situation like this." "Of course, Madam Secretary General," Maria replied, still puzzled by the high-level attention. "How can I help you?" "Actually," the Secretary General said, with a smile, "we're here to help you. Or rather, to ensure that you can help more people than ever before. She gestured to the other official. We've been meeting for the past 6 months about a proposal that originated from your work here and around the world. The president of Bangladesh stepped forward. Dr. Thompson, your mobile surgical units have saved over 3,000 lives in our country alone. Over the past 5 years, the innovations you've pioneered have revolutionized how we respond to natural disasters not just here but globally. What we're announcing today, the WHO Director General continued, is the Thompson Protocol, a new international standard for emergency medical response that will be implemented by every major relief organization and military medical unit in the world. It's based entirely on the methods and technologies you've developed. Maria felt a familiar mix of pride and humility as she processed what they were telling her. Having her approaches become the global standard would mean that the lessons learned in Afghanistan, refined through countless deployments, and proven in dozens of countries, would now be available to save lives everywhere. But there's more, the Secretary General said. The United Nations is creating a new position, Director of Global Medical Innovation and Response. It's essentially redesigning how we approach medical emergencies worldwide, and we want you to lead this effort. The position comes with a mandate to establish Thompson centers in every region of the world, the WHO director added. Each center will train local medical personnel, maintain rapid response capabilities, and serve as research hubs for continuing innovation in emergency medicine. Maria looked around at the refugee camp, at the thousands of people whose lives had been disrupted by forces beyond their control, at the medical teams working tirelessly to help them. The offer was incredible, but she had learned over the years to measure opportunities not by their prestige, but by their potential impact. How many lives could this save, she asked simply. Conservative estimates suggest the Thompson Protocol could save an additional 50,000 lives per year, the president of Bangladesh replied. The research and innovation capabilities of the Thompson centers could push that number much higher. As Maria considered the proposal, her mind wandered back to that night 10 years ago, when Sarah had asked what she had accomplished during her military service. The question had seemed designed to humiliate, to prove that her years of service had been meaningless. Now the methods she had developed in Afghan field hospitals were being adopted as the global standard for emergency medical care. Dr. Thompson, came another familiar voice, and Maria turned to see Sarah approaching with Jonathan Pierce and a film crew. Over the past decade, Sarah had become something of a documentarian, creating films about hidden heroes and unrecognized service. Her latest project, a documentary about the global impact of the mobile surgical units, had won several international awards and helped raise funding for expansion of the Torres Foundation. I hope you don't mind, Sarah said, gesturing to the cameras, but this moment needed to be recorded. Not for you, but for everyone who needs to understand what one person with dedication and vision can accomplish. Maria looked at her sister, seeing not the cruel, competitive woman from that gala, but someone who had found her own way to serve others through storytelling and advocacy. Sarah's transformation had been as complete as her own, perhaps more so because it required confronting and changing fundamental aspects of her character. The documentary comes out next month, Jonathan added, now in his 60s but still actively involved in humanitarian technology development. We're calling it What She Amounted To. It follows the entire journey from that night at the gala to today. The film's already been selected for Sundance, Emma said excitedly, and 3 major networks want to air it as a special presentation. Maria shook her head in amazement. 10 years ago, she had been dismissed as someone who would never amount to anything. Now her story was being told at international film festivals, her methods were becoming global policy, and her name was being attached to centers that would train medical professionals around the world. But as she looked around at the refugee camp, at the patients being saved, at the young veterans who had found purpose through the foundation, Maria realized that the external recognition, while gratifying, wasn't what truly mattered. What mattered was the work itself, the lives being saved, the skills being passed on, the cycle of service being perpetuated. I accept the position, she told the Secretary General, on one condition. What's that? The first Thompson Center is established here, in Bangladesh, trained and staffed primarily by local medical personnel. We're not here to impose solutions from the outside. We're here to share what we've learned and help local communities build their own capability." The Secretary General smiled. "Dr. Thompson, that's exactly why you're the right person for this job." As the delegation prepared to leave and the medical teams returned to their life-saving work, Maria reflected on the strange journey that had brought her from a humiliating family dinner to international recognition. The path had been neither straight nor easy, but it had led to something she could never have imagined: a legacy that would outlive her, systems that would save lives long after she was gone, and a model for how one person's dedication to service could ripple outward to change the world. Later that evening, as she sat in her tent reviewing the medical reports from the day's operations, Maria received a message on her tablet. It was from Captain Martinez, the young veteran she had mentored at the gala 5 years earlier, now stationed at a disaster relief operation in the Philippines. "Thompson," the message read, "I wanted you to know that today I had the chance to help a young soldier who was struggling with civilian transition. I told her your story, about how sometimes the people who seem to amount to nothing are actually changing the world one life at a time. I think it helped her see possibilities she couldn't see before. Thank you for teaching me that our worth isn't determined by other people's recognition of it." The cycle continued. Maria smiled as she read the message, understanding that this was what amounting to something really meant: not the awards or recognition or career advancement, but the simple act of helping others realize their own potential for service and impact. The story that had begun with Sarah's cruel dismissal had become something far larger, a reminder that human worth couldn't be measured by conventional metrics, and that sometimes the most important work in the world was done by people whose value remained hidden until the moment it was most needed. The circle had become a spiral, reaching ever outward, touching lives in ways that could never be fully measured or completely understood. And in that infinite expansion of impact, Maria found the true answer to what it meant to amount to something. It meant recognizing that every person carries within them the potential to change the world, and helping them find the courage to use it. 12 years after the charity gala that changed everything, Maria Thompson stood in the construction site of what would become the flagship Thompson Center in Geneva, Switzerland. The massive complex, scheduled to open in 6 months, would serve as the global headquarters for emergency medical innovation and the training center for the Thompson Protocol that was now standard practice in Fort. The morning sun reflected off the steel framework of the building's revolutionary design, a structure that could be rapidly converted into a functioning hospital within hours of any emergency. Every aspect of the center had been designed around the principle that had guided Maria's entire career: readiness to serve when it mattered most. "Dr. Thompson," came a voice behind her, and she turned to see Elena Vasquez, the young engineer who had been tasked with designing the Thompson Center's modular system. Elena was one of hundreds of professionals whose careers had been shaped by the Foundation's mission, having started as a mechanical engineering student, whose senior thesis on battlefield medical equipment had caught the attention of the Torres Foundation Selection Committee. "The simulation systems are online and ready for testing," Elena reported, her voice carrying the excitement of someone whose childhood dreams of helping people had found expression in cutting-edge medical technology. "We'll be able to train teams for any emergency scenario imaginable, from natural disasters to conflict zones to pandemic response." Maria nodded, walking with Elena toward the center's main building. The sight that greeted them inside was breathtaking. A vast training facility where holographic projections could recreate any emergency scenario, where medical teams could practice life-saving procedures under stress, where innovations could be tested and refined before being deployed in real-world situations. "Dr. Thompson," called out a familiar voice, and Maria smiled as she saw Captain Rebecca Santos approaching. Rebecca had recently been promoted to Director of Field Operations for all Thompson Centers, overseeing the deployment and training programs that were now active on every continent. "Rebecca," Maria greeted her warmly, "how are the preparations for the opening ceremony?" "Beyond anything we imagined," Rebecca replied, her expression one of amazement. "The response list includes heads of state from 63 countries, representatives from every major medical organization in the world, and over 2,000 veterans who have been trained through our program." She paused, consulting her tablet. "Oh, and the media coverage is unprecedented. Sarah's documentary has sparked so much interest that we're having to live stream the ceremony to accommodate global demand. Maria felt a familiar mix of pride and discomfort with the attention. Even after 12 years of recognition and accolades, she remained most comfortable when the focus was on the work rather than the person doing it. But she had learned to accept that sometimes personal recognition was necessary to advance larger goals. Thompson, Elena said, pointing to one of the training modules, "There's something I wanted to show you. We've incorporated a special scenario into the training program." She led Maria to a holographic display that showed a familiar scene, a forward operating base in Afghanistan, complete with the sounds of distant artillery and the chaos of mass casualty events. The scenario was labeled Kandahar Protocol, the Thompson Stand. "It's based on the mission reports from your deployment," Elena explained. "The day you saved 41 children from that school bombing, every medical team that trains here will learn the techniques you developed that day, the decision-making process, the innovation under pressure." She looked at Maria with obvious reverence. "In a way, every person who survives because of what teams learn here owes their life partly to what you did in that tent 13 years ago." Maria watched the holographic recreation of one of the most challenging days of her life, seeing it now not as a traumatic memory but as a template for saving future lives. The transformation of personal experience into universal knowledge felt like the completion of a circle she hadn't even known she was drawing. "There's more," Rebecca added, leading them to another section of the facility, the memorial wall. What Maria saw took her breath away. An entire wall of the center was dedicated to the names of every person who had been saved by Thompson Protocol procedures over the past 12 years. The names were etched in glass panels that caught and refracted light, creating an almost ethereal glow throughout the space. "Over 100,000 names so far," Rebecca said quietly, "and that's just the ones we've been able to document. The actual number is probably much higher." Maria stared at the wall, each name representing a life that continued because of techniques developed in Afghanistan, refined in disaster zones, and now taught in centers around the world. Among the names she noticed familiar ones. Emma Pierce was there, listed as the first life saved by the foundational techniques that would become the Thompson Protocol. "Dr. Thompson," came another voice, and Maria turned to see Jonathan Pierce approaching with an elderly woman she didn't immediately recognize. As they drew closer, however, Maria's breath caught. "Miss Torres," she said softly, recognizing the mother of Sergeant Michael Torres, the friend whose death had motivated so much of her work. Mrs. Torres was now in her 80s, but her eyes held the same strength that Maria remembered from their first meeting at the Foundation's launch. "Doc Thompson," Mrs. Torres said, taking Maria's hands in hers, "I wanted to see this place before the opening ceremony. I wanted to understand what my son's sacrifice has become." Jonathan gestured around the facility. "Mrs. Torres, your son's name is going to be on the main auditorium. Every person who trains here will learn about Sergeant Michael Torres and the values that inspired this entire movement." Mrs. Torres nodded, tears streaming down her cheeks. "He would be so proud," she whispered, "not just of what you've accomplished, but of how you've honored his memory by helping others find their own way to serve." As they walked through the facility together, Maria reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. The Thompson Centers represented more than just medical training facilities. They were monuments to the principle that human potential could never be measured by conventional metrics, that the most important contributions often came from unexpected sources. "Thompson," Elena said, as they completed their tour, "there's one more thing. The dedication ceremony isn't just about opening this center. The UN has decided to declare an annual International Day of Hidden Heroes, to be celebrated every year on the anniversary of your original gala speech." Maria shook her head in amazement. The idea that her personal story had evolved into an international recognition of unsung service seemed almost impossible to believe. "The theme this year," Rebecca added, "is what will you amount to?" Challenging everyone to look beyond conventional definitions of success and find their own way to make a meaningful contribution. As the afternoon wore on and the group prepared to leave the construction site, Maria received a message on her tablet from Dr. Jessica Martinez, now serving as the Chief Medical Officer for the Thompson Center Network. The message was brief but powerful. Dr. Thompson, I wanted you to know that today we received our 500th application from veterans seeking medical training through the Torres Foundation. The cycle continues, and it's beautiful. Maria smiled as she read the message, understanding that this was what legacy truly meant, not personal recognition or career advancement, but the creation of systems and opportunities that would continue to serve others long after she was gone. The Thompson Centers would train medical professionals for decades to come. The Torres Foundation would help veterans find purpose and service for generations. The protocols and innovations developed from her battlefield experience would save lives around the world indefinitely. As she left the construction site and drove back toward her hotel, Maria thought about that night 12 years ago when Sarah had asked what she had accomplished. The question had seemed designed to humiliate, to prove that her service had been meaningless. Now, driving past signs advertising the opening of a center that would train the next generation of emergency medical responders, Maria realized that the answer to Sarah's question had become larger than either of them could have imagined. She had amounted to something that would outlive her, something that would continue to save lives and develop human potential long after she was gone. She had become not just a person who served others, but a catalyst for creating systems that would enable millions of others to serve as well. The building behind her would soon be filled with the sounds of training, innovation, and preparation. It would be a place where people discovered capabilities they didn't know they possessed, where veterans found new ways to serve, where the techniques developed in the most challenging circumstances would be passed on to new generations of healers. And in that continuity, in that endless cycle of service and growth, Maria found the true answer to what it meant to amount to something. It meant creating something larger than yourself that would continue to make the world better long after your own story had ended. The morning of the Thompson Center's grand opening dawned clear and bright over Geneva, Switzerland. As Maria Thompson stood on the balcony of her hotel room overlooking Lake Geneva, she could see the massive crowds already gathering around the center complex. Security personnel from dozens of countries worked to manage the logistics of what had become the largest gathering of medical and humanitarian leaders in history. The scale of attention still felt surreal to Maria. What had begun as a personal journey from humiliation to purpose had somehow evolved into a global movement that transcended any single person's story. Today, representatives from 107 countries would formally adopt the Thompson Protocol as the universal standard for emergency medical response. The ceremony would be broadcast live to an estimated audience of 500 million people worldwide. Maria came a gentle knock at her door, followed by Sarah's voice. "Are you ready for this?" Maria opened the door to find her sister standing in the hallway, holding 2 cups of coffee and wearing an expression that mixed excitement with nervous energy. Sarah had spent the past month coordinating the media coverage of the opening ceremony, ensuring that the focus remained on the mission and impact rather than on personal celebrity. "I don't think anyone could be ready for this," Maria replied honestly, accepting the coffee gratefully. "Sometimes I feel like I'm watching someone else's life unfold," Sarah smiled, stepping into the room and joining Maria on the balcony. "I've been thinking about that night 12 years ago," she said quietly, "about what I said to you, how I treated you." She paused, looking out at the crowds gathering below. "I keep wondering how many people are out there right now, going through what you went through, being dismissed, overlooked, told they'll never amount to anything." "Probably thousands," Maria said, "maybe millions. But today," Sarah continued, "when they see what you've accomplished, when they hear your story, maybe some of them will realize that other people's opinions don't determine their worth." She turned to look at her sister direct. "Maybe some of them will find the courage to keep serving, keep trying, keep believing in their own potential." An hour later, Maria found herself in the green tent behind the main stage, surrounded by a carefully controlled chaos of event coordinators, security personnel, and distinguished guests. Through the tent's fabric walls, she could hear the murmur of the massive crowd and the sounds of the international orchestra warming up for the opening ceremony. "Doc Thompson," came a familiar voice, and Maria looked up to see Emma Pierce approaching, now wearing the insignia of her new role as Deputy Director of Emergency Medicine for the Thompson Center Network. At 27, Emma had become one of the youngest senior administrators in international humanitarian medicine. Her rapid advancement, driven by a combination of exceptional skill and deep personal commitment to the mission, Emma, Maria smiled. How are you feeling about your new position? Terrified and excited in equal measure, Emma replied honestly, but also grateful beyond words. None of this would exist without what you did for me in that tent in Afghanistan 15 years ago. She paused, her voice becoming more serious. Doc Thompson, I wanted you to know that my first initiative as deputy director will be establishing a special program for children who survive trauma in conflict zones. We're going to help them find ways to transform their experiences into service to others. Before Maria could respond, Jonathan Pierce appeared at the tent entrance, his expression radiating pride and amazement. Maria, you need to see this, he said, gesturing toward the tent opening. The crowd is incredible. Maria stepped outside and felt her breath catch. The assembly area in front of the Thompson Center stretched as far as she could see, filled with people from every corner of the globe. She could see sections designated for different groups: medical professionals in their white coats, military personnel in dress uniform, veterans wearing the patches of units from dozens of countries, humanitarian workers carrying the flags of relief organizations, and thousands of civilians, whose lives had been touched by the Thompson Protocol in some way. Near the front of the assembly, she spotted a section reserved for families of people who had been saved by Thompson Protocol procedures. Among them, she could see Miss Torres sitting with dignity in her wheelchair, surrounded by other parents, spouses and children whose loved ones had survived because of innovations that had emerged from that terrible day in Kandahar. Ladies and gentlemen, came the voice of the UN Secretary General over the sound system. Please welcome Dr. Maria Thompson. The roar that greeted Maria as she walked onto the stage was unlike anything she had ever experienced. It wasn't just applause. It was the sound of collective gratitude from representatives of every nation on Earth. As she looked out at the sea of faces, Maria saw veterans who had found new purpose through the Torres Foundation, medical professionals who had been trained in Thompson Protocol procedures, disaster survivors who owed their lives to mobile surgical units, and countless others whose stories had intersected with hers in ways both direct and indirect. The ceremony that followed was both grand and deeply personal. The Secretary General announced the formal adoption of the Thompson Protocol by all UN member nations. The President of the International Committee of the Red Cross declared the establishment of Thompson emergency response teams in 50 major metropolitan areas worldwide. The Director General of the World Health Organization unveiled plans for 1,000 new Thompson-trained medical professionals to be deployed annually to underserved regions. But the moment that brought tears to Maria's eyes came when a group of children from around the world took the stage. They were survivors of various disasters and conflicts who had been saved by Thompson Protocol procedures, and they had prepared a presentation about their dreams for the future. One by one, they shared their aspirations to become doctors, teachers, engineers, humanitarian workers and leaders who would help others in turn. My name is Amara, said a 12-year-old girl from Bangladesh, stepping forward to the microphone. 3 years ago, Doc Thompson's team saved my life when our village was flooded. Today, I want to become a doctor so I can save other children like me. Her voice was clear and strong as she continued. Doc Thompson taught me that what matters is not what other people think you can become, but what you choose to do with the life you've been given. The child's words hit Maria with unexpected force, not because they were directed at her, but because they represented the endless multiplication of impact that had grown from her original commitment to serve. Every child on that stage represented dozens of future lives that would be saved, problems that would be solved, innovations that would be developed by people who might never have existed without the work being celebrated today. As the ceremony continued with speeches from world leaders and presentations of awards and recognitions, Maria found her attention drawn not to the dignitaries on stage, but to the faces in the crowd. She saw a young man in the veterans section who reminded her of herself 12 years ago, uncertain, struggling to find his place in civilian life, probably feeling overlooked and undervalued. She saw a woman in medical scrubs whose expression suggested she was questioning her own capabilities and potential for impact. During her own speech, Maria addressed these individuals directly. To everyone who has ever been told they'll never amount to anything, she said, her voice carrying clearly to every corner of the assembly. I want you to know that your worth is not determined by other people's recognition of it. Your value is not measured by salary or status, or social media followers. Your contribution to this world is determined by your willingness to use whatever gifts you have in service of something larger than yourself. She paused, looking directly at the veterans section. Some of you may be struggling to find your place in civilian life. You may feel like your military experience doesn't translate to meaningful civilian careers. I want you to know that the skills you developed in service, leadership under pressure, decision-making, in crisis situations, commitment to mission accomplishment, these are exactly the capabilities our world needs most. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Veterans throughout the assembly rose to their feet, followed by medical professionals, humanitarian workers, and finally the entire crowd in a standing ovation that lasted nearly 10 minutes. As Maria concluded her remarks and the ceremony moved toward its formal close, she received a message on her tablet from Dr. Jessica Martinez, who was watching the ceremony from a disaster response operation in the Philippines. The message was simple but profound. Dr. Thompson, watching this ceremony from our field hospital here, I can see the future you've created. There are young medics here who learned Thompson Protocol as standard training, who have no idea they're using techniques developed in Afghanistan. Your innovations have become so fundamental to emergency medicine that they're invisible, just the way medicine is supposed to work. That's the ultimate success. As the ceremony ended and the massive crowd began to disperse, Maria remained on stage for a few moments, absorbing the magnitude of what had transpired. 12 years ago, she had been told she would never amount to anything. Today, representatives of every nation on Earth had gathered to celebrate innovations that would save lives for generations to come. But as meaningful as the recognition was, Maria understood that the real victory wasn't in the ceremony or the accolade. It was in the knowledge that systems were now in place that would continue to serve others long after she was gone, that thousands of people had been inspired to find their own ways to contribute, and that the cycle of service and innovation would continue expanding indefinitely. The question of what she had amounted to had been answered not just for her, but for anyone who had ever felt dismissed or undervalued. The answer was this: you amount to exactly what you choose to contribute, and that contribution, however small it might seem, has the potential to change the world in ways you might never fully understand. 15 years after the charity gala that changed everything, Maria Thompson sat in her study overlooking the Potomac River, reading the latest quarterly report from the Thompson Center Network. At 54, she had officially stepped back from operational leadership, serving now as chairman emeritus, while younger, equally dedicated professionals carried forward the mission. The numbers in the report were staggering. Over 750,000 documented lives saved, Thompson centers operating in 89 countries, and more than 15,000 medical professionals trained in the protocol that had originated in an Afghan field hospital decades earlier. But what captured her attention most wasn't the statistics, it was a handwritten letter that had arrived that morning from Dr. Amara Khatun, the young girl from Bangladesh who had spoken at the Geneva ceremony 3 years earlier. Now 15 and attending medical school through a Thompson Foundation scholarship, Amara had written to share news of her first successful surgery, performed using techniques she had learned from instructors who had themselves been trained by Maria. The circle keeps getting bigger, Maria murmured to herself, smiling as she read about Amara's confidence and skill in the operating room. What circle is that? Came a familiar voice from the doorway. Maria looked up to see Sarah entering with 2 cups of tea, a ritual they had maintained every Sunday for the past 5 years since Sarah had moved to Washington to be closer to her sister. Amara just performed her first solo surgery, Maria said, holding up the letter. A complex trauma repair on a child who was injured in a construction accident. She saved the little boy's life. Sarah settled into the chair across from Maria's desk, her expression reflecting the mixture of pride and amazement that had become familiar whenever they discussed the ongoing impact of Maria's work. At 44, Sarah had found her own form of meaningful contribution, having established a media foundation that told the stories of unrecognized service members and civilian heroes around the world. Do you remember, Sarah said quietly, when you used to carry Mike Torres's flag everywhere? You were so convinced that you owed it to him to make your life count for something. Maria nodded, glancing toward the corner of her study where the carefully preserved flag now rested in a place of honor. surrounded by photos of the thousands of people whose lives had been touched by the foundation bearing Mike's name. I wonder what he would think about all this, Maria said. A 15-year-old girl in Bangladesh performing surgery using techniques that evolved from what we learned in Kandahar. Veterans around the world finding new ways to serve through the foundation. Medical innovations that started in a tent under mortar fire now being taught in the most advanced hospitals on Earth. I think, Sarah said carefully, he would be proud that his sacrifice became the seed for something that keeps growing and saving lives every day. She paused, sipping her tea. But I also think he would say that you've carried the weight of his memory long enough. That it's time to rest in the knowledge that his legacy is secure. Their conversation was interrupted by Maria's phone buzzing with a video call notification. The caller ID showed Emma Pierce, now 32 and serving as the global director of Thompson Centers, calling from a disaster response operation in Turkey, where a massive earthquake had triggered the largest emergency medical response in the region's history. Emma, Maria answered, accepting the video call. How are things in Turkey? Emma's face appeared on the screen, tired but animated with the energy that came from meaningful work under pressure. Behind her, Maria could see the familiar activity of a Thompson mobile unit in full operation. Medical personnel moving with practiced efficiency, patients being treated with the kind of coordinated care that had become standard wherever the protocol was implemented. Dr. Thompson, I wanted you to see this, Emma said, turning her tablet to show the scene around her. We've deployed 15 Thompson units here, and they're working alongside local medical teams that were trained at our center. The level of coordination and capability is incredible. It's exactly what you envisioned when you designed the whole system. Maria watched the screen with satisfaction, seeing not just the technology and techniques she had helped develop, but the human connections and collaborative spirit that had always been at the heart of the mission. Emma, how many lives do you estimate you've saved in the past week? Conservative estimate, about 800, Emma replied, but the real number is probably higher. And Dr. Thompson, here's the beautiful part. Half of our team leaders are veterans who found their way into medicine through the Torres Foundation. They're teaching local medical staff, who will go on to train others, who will train others. She smiled. The circle keeps expanding. After the call ended, Maria and Sarah sat in comfortable silence for a while, each lost in their own thoughts about the journey that had brought them to this point. The relationship between the sisters had been transformed completely, built now on a foundation of mutual respect, shared purpose, and genuine affection that had grown from their willingness to confront past hurts and work toward healing. Maria, Sarah said eventually, I have something I want to share with you. She reached into her bag and pulled out a bound manuscript. I've been working on this for 2 years. Maria accepted the manuscript and read the title page, What She Amounted to, the complete story of Maria Thompson and the Global Revolution in Emergency Medicine. Below the title was a subtitle that made Maria's breath catch, A Study in Hidden Potential and the Transformation of Human Service. Sarah, it's more than just your story, Sarah interrupted gently. It's about the principle you've proven, that human worth can't be measured by conventional metrics, that the most important contributions often come from unexpected sources, that everyone carries within them the potential to change the world. She leaned forward earnestly. I want this book to reach people who are sitting where you were 15 years ago, feeling dismissed and undervalued. I want them to understand that their current circumstances don't determine their ultimate impact. Maria paged through the manuscript, seeing chapter titles that chronicled not just her own journey, but the stories of dozens of other people whose lives had been transformed by finding their own ways to serve. Jessica Martinez's evolution, from lost veteran to medical leader. Rebecca Santos's transition from military service to humanitarian coordination. Elena Vasquez's development, from engineering student to innovator, and hundreds of others whose paths had intersected with the Thompson Network. The final chapter, Sarah said, is titled, The Answer. It's about how you ultimately answered the question I asked that night, what you had accomplished with your military service. But more than that, it's about how you redefined what it means to accomplish something meaningful. As evening approached, Maria found herself on her apartment's balcony, looking out at the city lights of Washington, D.C. In the distance, She could see the lights of Walter Reed Medical Center, where Thompson protocol procedures were now routine parts of trauma care. Closer to home, she could see the building that housed the Torres Foundation's headquarters, where even at this hour, young veterans were probably working with counselors and advisors to plan their transitions into medical careers. Her phone buzzed with a text message from Ms. Torres, now 87 and living in an assisted care facility in San Antonio. The message was brief but powerful. Dr. Thompson, I saw the news about the earthquake response in Turkey. Every time I see those Thompson units saving lives, I think about my Michael and how proud he would be. Thank you for making sure his sacrifice keeps meaning something. Maria typed back, Mrs. Torres, Michael's sacrifice is the foundation that everything else was built on. His memory is alive in every life saved, every veteran who finds new purpose, every innovation that helps others. He is not forgotten. As she prepared for bed that night, Maria reflected on the strange arithmetic of impact. 15 years ago, Sarah had asked what she had accomplished during her military service, implying that the answer was nothing. Now the innovations developed from that service had saved 750,000 documented lives, with the real number likely much higher. Veterans around the world had found new purpose and careers through programs that honored fallen comrades. Medical schools taught techniques that had been developed under fire in Afghanistan. Children who might not have survived disasters now grew up to become doctors, teachers, engineers, and leaders who would save and inspire others in turn. But perhaps the most profound accomplishment was the simplest, proving that human worth was not determined by other people's recognition of it, that the most important work in the world often happened in the shadow, and that anyone, absolutely anyone, could amount to something extraordinary if they were willing to use their gifts in service of others. As she drifted off to sleep, Maria's last thought was of all the people around the world who were at that moment discovering their own potential for service and impact. Inspired by stories of transformation and possibility, the circle that had begun with her own journey from humiliation to purpose would continue expanding forever, limited only by humanity's capacity to recognize and develop the hidden potential that existed in every person who had ever been told they would never amount to anything. The answer to Sarah's question had become larger than either of them could have imagined, and it would continue growing long after both of their stories had ended. 18 years after the charity gala that changed everything, Maria Thompson sat in the oncology wing of Johns Hopkins Hospital, holding a letter from a young combat medic in Syria whose life had been saved using Thompson protocol procedure. The irony wasn't lost on her. She was receiving news of lives saved while confronting her own mortality. The pancreatic cancer diagnosis had come 6 months earlier, and despite access to the best medical care in the world, the prognosis remained unchanged, perhaps a year, maybe 18 months if she was fortunate. Dr. Thompson, came a gentle voice from the doorway. Maria looked up to see Dr. Namura Khatun, now 24 and completing her surgical residency at Johns Hopkins. The young woman who had once been a flood victim in Bangladesh now stood as one of the most promising trauma surgeons of her generation, having specifically requested to work with Maria during her treatment. Maria smiled, setting aside the letter. How did the surgery go this morning? Beautifully, Amura replied, settling into the chair beside Maria's bed. A 7-year-old boy with complex abdominal trauma from a car accident. We used the modified Kandahar technique you developed, the one that saved my life 15 years ago. She paused, her expression becoming more serious. Dr. Thompson, I wanted to talk to you about something. Maria nodded, recognizing the careful tone that suggested an important conversation was coming. The Thompson Foundation Board has been discussing succession planning. Amura continued. They want to ensure that your vision and values continue to guide the organization. She struggled with the words, unable to directly mention Maria's terminal diagnosis. After I'm gone, Maria finished gently. Amura, that's exactly what should be happening. The most important thing I can do now is help ensure that the mission continues and grows without depending on any single person. But Dr. Thompson, you are the mission. You're the one who proved that people dismissed as failures can change the world. You're the one who showed us that service matters more than recognition, that impact matters more than income. Amura's voice grew passionate. How do we continue that without you? Maria looked at the young woman who had traveled such an extraordinary journey from disaster victim to surgeon, and felt a deep sense of completion. Amura, look around this hospital. Every day medical professionals use techniques that evolved from what we learned in Afghanistan. They don't think about where those techniques came from. They're just part of how medicine is practiced now. She smiled. That's the ultimate success, when your innovations become so fundamental that they're invisible. Their conversation was interrupted by Sarah entering the room with Emma Pierce, both looking tired but determined. Sarah had spent the past months coordinating what she called the transition project, ensuring that Maria's story and principles would continue to inspire others long after her death. Maria, Sarah said, settling into another chair. We have news from the foundation board meeting. Emma opened her tablet and began reading. The board has approved the establishment of the Maria Thompson Institute for Hidden Potential. It will be dedicated to identifying and developing recognized talent in every field, not just medicine, but education, technology, social work, engineering, everything. Maria felt her breath catch. That's not what I expected. There's more, Sarah continued. The Institute will work with organizations around the world to change how they identify and develop talent. Instead of looking only at traditional credentials and conventional success markers, they'll use principles you've proven. That potential often exists in unexpected places, that past circumstances don't determine future contributions, that the most valuable people are often those who have been overlooked. Thompson, Emma added. We've already received commitments from 47 major corporations, 18 universities and 12 government agencies to pilot these new talent identification methods. They want to find their own hidden Maria Thompson. As the conversation continued, Maria found herself thinking about the young woman she had been 18 years ago, dismissed by her sister, struggling to find her place in civilian life, carrying the weight of military service that seemed to have no value in the corporate world. That woman could never have imagined that her story would become the foundation for changing how entire societies recognized and developed human potential. There's something else, Sarah said, pulling out her phone. I received a call from the UN Secretary General this morning. She wants to establish a global recognition program called the Thompson Awards, given annually to people who exemplify the principle that human worth isn't determined by external validation. Maria shook her head in amazement. You're creating monuments to something that was always supposed to be about service, not recognition. No, Amara said firmly. We're creating systems to ensure that other people who feel dismissed and overlooked will remember that their worth isn't determined by other people's opinions of them. We're making sure that the next person who gets told they'll never amount to anything will know that assessment might be completely wrong. Over the following weeks, as Maria's condition gradually worsened, she was amazed by the stream of visitors who came to see her. Veterans who had found new careers through the Torres Foundation, medical professionals who had trained at Thompson centers, disaster survivors whose lives had been saved by Thompson protocol procedures, government officials whose policies had been influenced by her principle, children and young adults whose educational opportunities had been created by programs inspired by her example. Each visitor brought stories of impact that Maria had never known about. A teacher in rural Kenya who had been inspired by Maria's story to develop innovative education methods for children affected by conflict. An engineer in Bangladesh who had designed flood-resistant housing after being motivated by Maria's example of using technical skills for humanitarian purposes. A social worker in Detroit who had created programs for homeless veterans after reading about the Torres Foundation's approach to helping people transition from military to civilian service. Dr. Thompson, said Dr. Jessica Martinez during one of her visits, I need you to understand something. You didn't just save lives with your medical innovations, you saved the idea that every person has value, that everyone deserves a chance to contribute, that society is stronger when we recognize potential in unexpected places. As autumn turned to winter, Maria found herself spending increasing amounts of time reflecting on the journey that had brought her to this point. The question that had haunted her for so many years, what she had accomplished during her military service, now seemed almost quaint in its limitations. The answer had grown far beyond anything she could have imagined. She had proved that human worth wasn't determined by other people's recognition of it. She had demonstrated that the most important contributions often came from those who had been dismissed or overlooked. She had created systems that would continue to identify and develop hidden potential long after she was gone. She had inspired a global movement that valued service over status, impact over income, character over credential. But perhaps most importantly, she had shown that anyone, absolutely anyone, could amount to something extraordinary if they were willing to use their gifts in service of something larger than themselves. On a quiet December evening, as snow fell outside her hospital window, Maria received one final letter that brought everything full circle. It was from a young Army medic named Private First Class David Chen, serving in a field hospital in Somalia. He wrote, "Thompson, I wanted you to know that yesterday I saved 3 children using techniques I learned from the Thompson Protocol Manual. My commanding officer told me about your story, how you were once dismissed as someone who would never amount to anything, and how you proved that assessment completely wrong. I wanted to thank you for showing people like me that our current circumstances don't determine our ultimate value. I plan to go to medical school when my service ends. Inspired by your example." The circle continues. Maria smiled as she folded the letter carefully and placed it with the thousands of others she had received over the years. The young medic in Somalia would never know that his letter had arrived on the exact anniversary of that terrible night at the charity gala 18 years earlier. But perhaps that timing was fitting. A reminder that what had begun as personal humiliation had become a source of inspiration for people around the world who needed to believe in their own hidden potential. As she drifted off to sleep that night, Maria's last conscious thought was of all the people whose lives would be changed by the systems and principles that would outlive her. The Institute for Hidden Potential would identify and develop talent that might otherwise be overlooked. The Thompson Awards would celebrate contributions that might otherwise go unrecognized. The stories and examples would continue to inspire people who felt dismissed to keep believing in their own worth. The question of what she had amounted to had been answered definitively, but more importantly, she had ensured that millions of others would have the opportunity to discover their own answers to that same question, supported by systems that recognized potential wherever it existed and valued service over recognition. The circle that had begun with her own journey from humiliation to purpose would continue expanding forever, limited only by humanity's willingness to see worth in unexpected places and develop potential wherever it was found. 25 years after a sister's cruel words at a charity gala, the annual Maria Thompson Memorial Gala had become the most prestigious humanitarian event in the world, held once again in the grand ballroom of the Riverside Convention Center in Philadelphia. The evening brought together heads of state, Nobel laureates and leaders from every field of human endeavor. But tonight was different. Tonight marked the publication of the definitive study that would forever change how humanity understood potential, worth, and success. Sarah Thompson Martinez, now 64 and one of the world's most respected documentarians and social researchers, stood at the podium where her sister had once been honored. Her hair was silver now, but her voice carried the strength of someone who had spent decades proving that people could fundamentally change and that redemption was always possible. 25 years ago, Sarah began, her voice carrying to every corner of the silent ballroom. I sat at table 12 in this very room, and told my sister she would never amount to anything. Tonight I stand before you to share the final results of the most comprehensive study of human impact ever conducted. A study that has fundamentally changed how we measure worth and recognize potential. In the front row sat Amira Khatun, now 49 and serving as Director General of the World Health Organization. Beside her was Dr. Emma Pierce, Director of the United Nations Institute for Global Medical Innovation. Next to them sat Dr. Jessica Martinez, whose pioneering work in veteran transition programs had helped over 100,000 former service members find meaningful civilian careers. The Thompson study, Sarah continued, examined the life outcomes of 50,000 individuals who were initially dismissed, overlooked, or told they lacked potential. What we discovered will challenge everything you thought you knew about human capability and the nature of success itself. The massive screens around the ballroom lit up with stunning statistics. 89% of study participants who received support based on Thompson principles exceeded all initial predictions of their potential. Organizations that implemented Thompson talent identification methods saw 340% improvement in innovation metrics. Communities that applied Thompson recognition programs reduced unemployment by 67% while increasing civic engagement by. But here's what stunned us most, Sarah said, her voice growing emotional. We traced the ripple effects of just one person's journey, my sister Maria's, and found that her story had directly or indirectly influenced over 14 million lives worldwide. A murmur of amazement rippled through the audience as the screens showed a visual representation of this impact. Medical lives saved, veterans redirected to meaningful careers, children inspired to pursue education, communities transformed by people who found their hidden potential, innovations developed by those who had been overlooked. Maria saved 47 children in that hospital tent in Afghanistan, Sarah continued, but those children grew up to become doctors, teachers, engineers, and leaders who saved others. The veterans who found new purpose through her foundation went on to help other veterans. The medical professionals trained in her techniques taught others, who taught others. She paused, looking out at the audience with tears in her eyes. 14 million lives. And the number keeps growing every single day. At that moment, the ballroom doors opened, and a figure in a wheelchair was escorted to the front of the room. Miss Elena Torres, now 92 and one of the last surviving Gold Star mothers from the Afghanistan conflict, had insisted on attending despite her advanced age. The audience rose spontaneously as she was positioned beside the podium. Miss Torres, Sarah said gently, would you like to say something about your son Michael, whose sacrifice inspired so much of what we celebrate tonight? Mrs. Torres accepted the microphone with trembling hands, her voice weak but clear as crystal. My son died believing he was just doing his job, she said, but tonight I want every parent who has lost a child in service to know that their sacrifice echoes through eternity. Michael's name is on medical centers in 47 countries. His foundation has sent 8,000 veterans through medical school. His memory lives in every life saved by people he inspired. She paused, her voice growing stronger. He amounted to everything a mother could hope for, and so did everyone who carries his legacy forward. The standing ovation that followed lasted nearly 15 minutes, but it was interrupted by an announcement that left the entire audience speechless. Ladies and gentlemen, came the voice of the current UN Secretary General. We have a surprise guest tonight, joining us via satellite from the International Space Station. The screens around the ballroom showed astronaut Lisa Chen floating in zero gravity as Earth rotated slowly behind her. Dr. Thompson, she said, looking directly into the camera, I want you to know that even here 400 kilometers above Earth your legacy continues. The medical protocols we use aboard the space station are based on techniques you pioneered. The team selection methods NASA now uses were inspired by Thompson principles, looking for hidden potential rather than conventional credentials. She smiled. Maria Thompson proved that human worth couldn't be measured by traditional metrics. Now we're taking that principle to the stars. As the satellite connection ended, Sarah stepped back to the podium for her final remark. The question my sister faced 25 years ago, what she had amounted to, has become the question every human being must answer. What will you amount to? Not in terms of salary or status or social media followers, but in terms of your contribution to the endless story of human potential and service. She gestured to the assembled audience. Look around this room. Every person here represents thousands of lives touched, Millions of possibilities realized, countless innovations that emerged from someone who was once overlooked or dismissed. Her voice grew powerful. In this room tonight, there are probably dozens of people whose true potential remains hidden, even from themselves. People who have been told they'll never amount to anything. People who feel overlooked, undervalued, dismissed. The audience shifted uncomfortably, many recognizing themselves in her description. "I want you to understand something fundamental," Sarah continued, her voice now carrying the authority of decades of research and personal transformation. "Your worth is not determined by other people's reckoning of it. Your value is not measured by external validation. Your potential is not limited by current circumstances or past failures." She paused, looking directly into the cameras that were broadcasting her words to an estimated global audience of 800 million people. "The most important lesson my sister taught the world is this. Every human being carries within them the capacity to change the world. Every single person who has ever felt dismissed or overlooked possesses capabilities that could revolutionize medicine, transform education, solve environmental challenges, create art that inspires generations, or simply help one other person discover their own hidden potential." The screens around the ballroom began showing real-time social media responses from around the world as her words spread. "What will you amount to" was trending globally, with millions of people sharing their own stories of overcoming dismissal and finding purpose. 25 years ago, my sister was told she would never amount to anything, Sarah said, her voice now barely above a whisper but carrying clearly through the silent ballroom. Tonight, children around the world are alive because of medical techniques she pioneered. Veterans are finding purpose because of programs she inspired. Disasters are being managed with protocols she developed. Hidden potential is being recognized because of principles she proved. She looked directly at table 12, where a young Afghan refugee named Zara Ahmadi sat with her host family. Zara had arrived in America just 6 months earlier, speaking broken English and carrying trauma from her homeland. Few people in the room knew that she possessed extraordinary mathematical abilities that could revolutionize artificial intelligence, or that she would someday develop technologies that would solve climate change. She was at this moment exactly where Maria had been 25 years ago, overlooked, underestimated, carrying potential that the world had not yet recognized. "But here's the most important truth of all," Sarah concluded, her words carrying the weight of decades of learning and growth. Maria didn't amount to something because she was special. She amounted to something because she chose to use whatever gifts she had in service of others, because she refused to let other people's limited vision determine her self-worth, because she understood that the most meaningful success isn't measured by what you accumulate, but by what you contribute. The final slide appeared on the screens around the ballroom, showing a simple equation that would be taught in schools around the world for generations to come. "This is Maria's gift to the world," Sarah said. "Not just the lives she saved or the innovations she created, but the proof that every human being, every single one of us, carries within them the power to change the world. The only question is, what will you choose to amount to?" As the audience rose in the longest standing ovation in the event's history, something extraordinary happened. People began approaching Zara Ahmadi's table, drawn by an instinct they couldn't quite explain. Within minutes, she was surrounded by educators, technology leaders, and mentors, who somehow sensed that they were in the presence of hidden potential waiting to be discovered. The cycle was beginning again. Later that evening, as the ballroom emptied and the lights dimmed, a maintenance worker named James Rodriguez quietly cleaned the tables and stacked the chairs. Few people noticed him, but those who looked closely might have seen the Purple Heart pin he wore beneath his work uniform, or recognized the careful precision with which he moved, the bearing of someone with military training. James had lost his leg in an IED explosion in Syria. He had been told by doctors that his military career was over, by counselors that his prospects were limited, by family members that he should accept disability and a quiet life. But as he worked that night, he thought about the words he had heard from the stage. "Your worth is not determined by other people's recognition of it." In his backpack, hidden beneath his work clothes, was a notebook filled with designs for prosthetic devices that could revolutionize mobility for disabled veterans. He had been too afraid to show them to anyone, convinced that a janitor's ideas wouldn't be taken seriously. But tonight, Inspired by the story of a woman who had been dismissed and overlooked before changing the world, James made a decision. Tomorrow, he would find the courage to share his innovations. Tomorrow, he would begin to discover what he was meant to amount to. As the last lights went out in the ballroom and the city settled into sleep, the question Maria Thompson had answered so definitively echoed through millions of minds around the world. What will you amount to? The answer, as her sister had finally learned 25 years too late, was limited only by their willingness to serve others, and their courage to believe that human potential could never be measured by other people's recognition. In conference rooms and classrooms, hospitals and homeless shelters, military bases, and refugee camps, the next generation of hidden heroes was awakening to the possibility that they, too, might amount to something extraordinary. The circle was eternal, the potential infinite, and the question eternal: what will you amount to? The answer, as Maria Thompson had proven beyond all doubt, was entirely up to them. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.